What if you could hold a conversation with someone who lived 4,000 years ago? What would you ask them? How would it feel to hear their voice across the centuries? While we can't travel back in time, we can do something almost as magical. We can read their words, scattered across the globe, tucked away in caves, buried beneath desert sands, and preserved in the ruins of ancient cities, are the oldest manuscripts ever discovered. These aren't just artifacts, they are time capsules. Each cracked clay tablet, each fragile scrap of papyrus, contains a direct line to a human mind from a world we can barely comprehend. They are whispers from our distant past, and today we are going to listen. Think about the last message you wrote, a text, an email, a note. It captured a thought, a feeling, a moment in your life. Now imagine that message surviving not for days or years, but for millennia. Imagine it enduring wars, famines, the rise and fall of entire civilizations, even volcanic eruptions that buried entire cities in ash. The manuscripts we are about to explore have done exactly that. They have outlasted empires. They have defied the relentless decay of time itself. From the meticulously inscribed cuneiform on Mesopotamian tablets that predate the pyramids to the hauntingly beautiful Dead Sea Scrolls hidden in desert caves, these texts are more than historical records. They are triumphs of human persistence. They are proof that the urge to record, to communicate, to say, "I was here," is one of the most powerful and enduring forces in human history. So, join me on an extraordinary journey, a countdown through the very foundations of recorded knowledge. We will unearth stories of kings and commoners, of epic poems and mundane shopping lists, of divine prayers and mathematical calculations. We will see how a piece of fired clay or a sheet of prepared animal skin can become a bridge across time, connecting us directly to our ancestors. This is not just a list of old objects, it is an exploration of the human story itself, written in the most resilient ink imaginable. Get ready to discover the 25 oldest manuscripts ever found, and to hear the echoes of voices that have been silent for thousands of years. Our journey into the deepest past begins not in the deserts of Egypt or the plains of Mesopotamia, but in northern Syria at a mound known as Tel Marduk. For centuries, it was just another hill, its secrets buried under dust and time. Then, in the 1970s, an Italian archaeological team led by Paolo Mattii made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the world of ancient history. They uncovered the lost kingdom of Ebla, and within the ruins of its royal palace, they found a treasure far greater than gold, a royal archive. This wasn't just a handful of inscriptions. It was a library, a vast collection of over 20,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments, all carefully stored on shelves that had collapsed when the palace was destroyed around 2300 BC. To put that date in perspective, these clay tablets were already ancient when the pyramids of Giza were being built. They are, quite simply, one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. What makes the Ebla Tablets so extraordinary is the world they bring back to life. They aren't just one type of document, they are a complete cross-section of an entire civilization's consciousness. Written in both Sumerian, the scholarly language of the time, and Eblate, a previously unknown early Semitic language, these tablets reveal a highly sophisticated and bureaucratic society. We have administrative records detailing the distribution of textiles and metals, economic texts tracking the flow of grain and olive oil, and meticulously kept diplomatic correspondence. We can read treaties and royal decrees that outline Ebla's complex political relationships with neighboring powers, showing us an intricate web of alliances and rivalries in the Bronze Age. It's like finding the complete filing cabinet of a powerful, ancient government, frozen in a single moment of time. Perhaps the most profound revelation from Ebla was linguistic. The Eblate language found on these tablets is a treasure trove for linguists. It is one of the oldest known Semitic languages, providing a crucial missing link in our understanding of the evolution of languages like Akkadian, Hebrew, and Arabic. The library even contained bilingual dictionaries, lexical lists that painstakingly translated Sumerian words into Eblate. This was essentially a 3,000-year-old language textbook created by Ebla's scribes to navigate the complex intellectual world of their time. These lists didn't just help modern scholars decipher the language, they gave us a window into how the people of Ebla categorized their entire universe, from the names of gods and professions to the types of fish in their rivers and the stars in their sky. So, when we look at a single Ebla tablet, we are seeing more than a list of goods or a diplomatic letter. We are witnessing the birth of complex administration, the flow of international trade in the ancient world, and the very structure of human thought captured in clay. The kingdom of Ebla was a major power, a civilization that thrived and then was violently destroyed, its memory wiped away until those 20,000 tablets were pulled from the earth. They are a powerful reminder that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the everyday workings of society, the meticulous record-keeping that makes civilization possible, and the enduring human desire to put words and our world in order. From the bustling administrative world of Ebla, we journey now to the silent, sacred spaces of ancient Egypt, to a text not written on clay tablets, but carved directly into stone for eternity. High within the pyramids at Saqqara, on the walls of the burial chambers of 5th and 6th dynasty pharaohs, we find the pyramid texts. These are not mere inscriptions. They are the oldest known religious texts in the entire world, a collection of over 700 spells, incantations, and rituals meticulously chiseled into the very fabric of the tomb around 2400 BC. Their purpose was as grand as their setting, to serve as a divine guidebook, a collection of powerful utterances designed to protect the king's soul on its most perilous journey, and to ensure his successful resurrection and ascension to join the gods in the afterlife. This was the pharaoh's ultimate insurance policy for immortality, written in stone so it could never be lost or destroyed. Imagine the scene for a moment. A pharaoh has died. His mummified body has been sealed within the heart of this massive stone pyramid, a structure designed to touch the sky. The chamber is dark, silent, and sealed forever. But on the walls surrounding his sarcophagus, the words are alive with power. These spells were meant to be spoken, their magic activated by the priests who performed the rituals. They weren't intended for human eyes after the burial. They were a direct line of communication for the pharaoh's spirit, his ba, as it navigated the terrifying and wondrous landscape of the afterlife. The texts are filled with vivid, sometimes startling imagery. They describe the king transforming into a celestial being, climbing a ladder to the sky on a beam of sunlight, or ferrying across the waters of the heavens in the boat of the sun god Ra. They contain both desperate pleas for protection from demons and serpents, and triumphant declarations of the pharaoh's divine power, asserting his rightful place among the stars. The theology revealed in these texts is both complex and raw, offering an unparalleled window into the earliest formalized beliefs of ancient Egypt. Unlike the later, more standardized Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts show a religious tradition still in a state of dynamic formation. We see the merging of different and sometimes conflicting regional cults and traditions. In one spell, the deceased king is identified with Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection. In another, he becomes one with the sun god Ra. This wasn't seen as contradictory, but rather as ensuring the king had multiple paths to divinity. The spells also reveal a world where the boundaries between the divine, the natural, and the royal were fluid. The king could command the gods, threaten them, or plead with them. He could become a bird, a snake, or a dazzling light. This was a religion of ultimate pragmatism, using the power of the spoken and written word to bend cosmic forces to a single, crucial purpose: the eternal survival of the soul. The legacy of the pyramid texts is immense, forming the very bedrock of Egyptian religious thought for the next 2 millennia. These spells did not disappear with the Old Kingdom. They evolved. Over the centuries, these royal incantations began to be adapted for the elite nobility, inscribed not on pyramid walls, but on the inside of the wooden coffins of non-royal individuals. This new collection is what scholars call the coffin texts, democratizing an afterlife that was once reserved solely for the pharaoh. And from the coffin texts, this tradition of funerary magic continued to develop, eventually becoming the famous Book of the Dead, written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the tombs of commoners. So, when we look at a copy of the Book of the Dead from the New Kingdom, over 1,000 years later, we are seeing the direct intellectual and spiritual descendant of those first spells carved in the pyramids of Saqqara. The pyramid texts represent the genesis of a core human idea that through ritual and sacred words we can conquer death itself. They give voice to one of humanity's oldest and most profound hopes, echoing not in a whisper but in the commanding tone of a king addressing the gods. Moving from the sacred rituals of Egyptian pharaohs, we encounter a story not of gods but of a man, a powerful, flawed, and deeply human king whose epic quest echoes the very questions we still ask today. Found not in one single book but scattered across countless clay tablets in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh is arguably the world's oldest great work of literature. The most complete version we have comes from the magnificent library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a collection of over 30,000 tablets unearthed in the 19th century. But the story itself is far older. The oldest surviving fragments of the epic date back to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, meaning this tale was already being copied and recited for centuries before Homer composed the Iliad or the first verses of the Bible were set down. The epic centers on Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, who is described as 2/3 god and 1/3 man. He is a tyrant, a powerhouse of energy and strength who oppresses his people, driving them to build the mighty walls of his city without rest. In response to their pleas, the gods create a wild man named Enkidu, a primitive being who lives among the animals. Enkidu is brought to civilization, and after a titanic wrestling match with Gilgamesh, the two become the closest of friends. This friendship transforms Gilgamesh from a solitary bully into a compassionate leader. Together, they embark on grand adventures, journeying to the legendary cedar forest to slay its monstrous guardian, Humbaba. This act, however, is an offense against the gods, and they decree that Enkidu must die as punishment. The death of his friend shatters Gilgamesh. He is consumed by a terror he has never known, the fear of his own mortality. If the mighty Enkidu could die, then so too must Gilgamesh, despite his divine blood. This is the heart of the epic, and what makes it feel so astonishingly modern. Gilgamesh's subsequent quest is not for treasure or fame, but for the secret of eternal life. He abandons his kingdom and wanders to the ends of the earth, facing immense dangers, all to find Utnapishtim, the one man who was granted immortality by the gods. The themes here are universal and timeless: the transformative power of friendship, the struggle between civilization and nature, the arrogance of power, and the desperate human desire to escape the one fate that comes for everyone. It is a story about what it means to live a meaningful life in the face of certain death. When Utnapishtim finally tells Gilgamesh, "You have toiled without cease, and what have you got? You will be tired out, you will grow old, and in the end you will still die." It is a moment of profound, heartbreaking clarity. The quest for physical immortality fails, but in that failure, Gilgamesh finds a different kind of enduring legacy: the lasting fame of his deeds and the enduring walls of his city, Uruk. One of the most remarkable sections of the epic occurs on Tablet 11, when Utnapishtim reveals to Gilgamesh how he gained his immortality. He recounts a story that is eerily familiar. The gods, angry with humanity, decide to send a great flood to wipe out all life. But the god E warns Utnapishtim in secret, instructing him to build a massive cube-shaped boat and to take aboard the boat the seed of all living things. He loads his family, his craftsmen, and animals of every kind. a terrifying storm rages for 6 days, flooding the entire world and killing everyone else. The boat eventually comes to rest on a mountain, and Utnapishtim releases a dove, a swallow, and finally a raven to find dry land. He makes a sacrifice to the gods, who, smelling the sweet aroma, gather around like flies and regret their decision. For preserving life, Utnapishtim and his wife are granted eternal life. The parallels to the later flood narrative in the book of Genesis are impossible to ignore. The divine warning, the instruction to build a boat, the saving of animals, the sending out of birds to find land, the sacrifice afterward. The core structure of the story is virtually identical. This does not diminish the biblical account, but rather places it within a vast, ancient literary tradition. The Mesopotamian flood myth appears in earlier Sumerian stories and in the Atrahasis epic, predating the Hebrew Bible by well over 1,000 years. This shared narrative reveals a common cultural memory, perhaps even a distant echo of a real, catastrophic flood event in the region, retold and reshaped by different cultures over millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, therefore, is more than a single story. It is a cultural tapestry, weaving together earlier myths and legends into a profound exploration of the human condition, a work that continues to speak to us because it is, at its core, about us. Leaving behind the personal quest of Gilgamesh, we now turn to the story of a king who sought not just personal glory, but to impose order on an entire society. In the year 1901, French archaeologists excavating the ancient city of Susa in what is now Iran made a breathtaking discovery. It wasn't a golden treasure or a lost palace, but a massive black stone pillar standing over 7 feet tall. This was the Code of Hammurabi, carved from a single block of gleaming diorite stone around 1754 BC. It was placed in a public temple for all to see. At the top, a beautiful bas-relief shows King Hammurabi of Babylon standing before Shamash, the god of the sun and justice. Shamash is handing the king the symbols of royal power, a rod and a ring, symbolizing that these laws were not merely Hammurabi's own invention, but were divinely inspired and sanctioned. This wasn't just a list of rules, it was a public monument to the very idea of justice, a declaration that from this point forward, society would be governed by a known and consistent set of principles. What is written on this pillar is nothing short of a complete blueprint for an ancient civilization. The code consists of 282 laws, meticulously organized and written in the crisp, wedge-shaped script of Akkadian Cuneiform. These laws cover virtually every conceivable aspect of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. They dictate rules for commerce, laying out fair prices for goods and services. They establish standards for construction, specifying that if a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, then that builder shall be put to death. They govern agriculture, family law, slavery, and liability. This was a society grappling with the complexities of urban living, and Hammurabi's code was the official operating manual. Its famous principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was not merely about brutal retaliation. In its original context, this principle, known as lex talionis, was actually a revolutionary limitation on violence. It meant that the punishment must be proportional to the crime. You could not, for instance, wipe out a man's entire family because he caused the death of your son. The punishment had to fit the offense, preventing endless, escalating blood feuds and creating a predictable, state-administered system of justice. However, to view this code through a modern lens of equality would be a mistake. The Code of Hammurabi is a stark and honest reflection of a rigidly stratified society. It did not treat all people as equals before the law. Babylonian society was divided into 3 main classes: the free, property-owning class known as Awilim, a class of commoners or dependents called Mushkenim, and enslaved people or wardom. The punishment for a crime varied dramatically depending on the social status of the victim and the perpetrator. If a nobleman put out the eye of another nobleman, the law demanded his own eye be put out. But if that same nobleman put out the eye of a commoner, he merely paid a fine of silver. The law protected property and the established social hierarchy above all else. This hierarchy even extended into the family, where the father held absolute power, and wives and children were largely treated as his legal dependents. A son who struck his father could have his hand cut off, a brutal penalty designed to enforce respect for patriarchal authority. Yet, within this harsh framework, the code also contained surprising elements of protection for the vulnerable. It included what we might today consider consumer protection laws. A boatman who was careless and sank a customer's vessel had to replace both the boat and its cargo. It also offered certain rights to women, which was remarkable for the time. A woman could own property, run a business, and initiate a divorce under specific circumstances, such as if her husband was unjustly accusatory or had abandoned her. If divorced through no fault of her own, she was entitled to her dowry back, providing her with a measure of financial security. While these rights were not equal to those of men, they acknowledged women as legal entities, not merely as property. The code's very existence, carved in such a durable and public manner, sent a powerful message. It told every citizen, from the highest noble to the lowest commoner, what was expected of them and what they could, in theory, expect from their rulers and their neighbors. It created a framework of predictability in a world that was often chaotic and violent. The legacy of Hammurabi's stele is immense. While it is not the absolute earliest collection of laws, older Sumerian codes from kings like Ur-Nammu exist in fragmentary form. It is by far the most complete, detailed, and well-preserved legal document from the ancient world. It gives us an unparalleled, unvarnished look into the values, fears, and social structures of one of humanity's first great empires. It represents a monumental leap in the organization of human society, the moment when oral customs and the arbitrary judgments of rulers began to be codified into a written public standard. This idea that a government should rule by a known and consistent set of laws rather than by the whims of a king is a foundational concept that would echo down through the centuries, influencing later legal systems, including those of the Greeks and the Romans. The black diorite pillar discovered at Susa is more than a relic. It is the birth certificate of legal history, a testament to humanity's enduring struggle to define justice and build a society based on rules, however imperfect those first rules may have been. But what about the pain and frailty of the body itself? While kings were building pyramids and inscribing laws, there were people dealing with the universal human experiences of illness, injury, and the desperate search for a cure. Our next group of manuscripts takes us from the cosmic to the clinical, from the soul's journey to the physical body's ailments. We are entering the world of the Egyptian Medical Papyri, a collection of texts that reveal a level of scientific sophistication that is truly staggering for its time. These are not mere scrolls of magic and superstition, though those elements exist. They are detailed, systematic medical textbooks, blending empirical observation with a nascent understanding of human anatomy, and offering a rational approach to healing that would not be seen again in Europe for another 2,000 years. Among the most remarkable of these is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, acquired by the American collector Edwin Smith in Luxor in 1862. This document dates to around 1600 BC, though it is likely a copy of a much older text, possibly originating from the time of the pyramid builders themselves. What sets this papyrus apart is its stunningly modern scientific tone. It is the world's oldest known treatise on surgery and trauma. The text is organized with a logical, clinical consistency that feels familiar to any doctor today. It presents 48 cases of injuries starting at the top of the head and working methodically down the body. For each case, it provides a tripartite structure, the title which names the injury, the examination which details the symptoms and physical tests the physician should perform, the diagnosis where the physician declares the case as either an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, or an ailment not to be treated, and finally the treatment itself. This structure reveals a mind that is observing, classifying, and reasoning. For a wound to the skull, the text instructs the physician to ask the patient, "Where do you feel the pain?" and to palpate the wound, looking for a crackling sensation under the fingertips that would indicate a broken bone. It describes symptoms we still recognize today, such as a patient dragging his foot or suffering from priapism after a spinal injury. Most strikingly, when faced with a complex spinal cord injury that results in paralysis, the text concludes with the sobering diagnosis, an ailment not to be treated. This is not a failure of knowledge, but an admission of its limits, a profound understanding that some injuries are beyond the healer's art, a moment of heartbreaking honesty in a 4,000-year-old text. The treatments prescribed are practical and often effective, stitching wounds with a needle and thread, using honey as a natural antibacterial salve, applying raw meat to stop bleeding on the first day, and bandaging with linen. This is rational, evidence-based medicine, born from the brutal necessity of treating construction accidents, battlefield wounds, and the physical toll of a hard life. If the Edwin Smith Papyrus represents the cold, hard logic of the surgeon, then the Ebla Papyrus is the sprawling, encyclopedic knowledge of the general practitioner. This magnificent scroll, dating to around 1550 BC, is a massive compilation of medical knowledge, often called the most important medical text from ancient Egypt. It is over 20 meters long, a veritable encyclopedia of diseases, diagnoses, and hundreds of remedies covering every part of the body from the top of the head to the soles of the feet. It provides a more holistic view of Egyptian medicine, one where the rational and the magical coexist. The text acknowledges the role of gods and demons in causing illness, but its primary focus is on the physical body and its functions. It contains, for instance, the first known written description of the circulatory system, recognizing the heart as the center of a network of vessels carrying blood, air, and tears to every limb. The pharmacopoeia within the Ebla Papyrus is breathtaking in its scope and complexity. The ancient Egyptian physician had a vast natural pharmacy at their disposal. Remedies were concocted from a huge array of ingredients. Honey, garlic, and castor oil were staples for their well-understood medicinal properties, but the list goes far beyond simple herbs. They used willow leaves, which contain a precursor to aspirin for pain and inflammation. They used yeast from beer for skin infections, an early form of antibiotic therapy. They used powdered minerals like malachite and azurite as astringents. Some prescriptions were startlingly specific, calling for the fat of a lion, the tooth of a donkey, or the milk of a woman who has borne a male child, ingredients that clearly tap into a more symbolic or magical belief system. Yet, the instructions for preparing these medicines, boiling, straining, fermenting, and forming into pills, suppositories, and enemas, show a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology. The Egyptians understood dosage, creating prescriptions measured in precise units. They developed innovative delivery methods, such as inhaling steam from a medicinal potion to treat a cough, or inserting a garlic clove into the vagina as a diagnostic test for fertility, with the belief that if the smell could be detected on the patient's breath the next day, her tubes were clear. Together, these papyri paint a portrait of a medical tradition that was both advanced and holistic. The Egyptian physician, or SWNW, was a respected professional who blended careful observation, practical anatomy, a deep knowledge of the natural world, and spiritual beliefs. They knew how to set bones, reduce dislocations, and perform minor surgeries. They understood the importance of cleanliness in wound care. They diagnosed conditions like diabetes, depression, and parasitic infections. They were the first to use the word brain and observed the corrugated surface of that organ, linking injuries to it with specific physical outcomes. This was a system that sought to heal the whole person, acknowledging that illness could arise from both a physical wound and a spiritual imbalance. To read these papyri is to witness the birth of the doctor, not as a shaman, but as a scientist and a healer, a role that would remain fundamentally unchanged for millennia. Now let's journey from the sun-baked Nile to the sun-drenched islands and rugged coastlines of the Aegean Sea, to a civilization shrouded in myth and legend, the world of the Mycenaean Greeks. For centuries, the Greece of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, with its warrior kings like Agamemnon and its mighty citadels like Mycenae and Pylos, was considered just that, epic poetry, a magnificent story, but not necessarily history. That all changed with the discovery of thousands of small, unassuming clay tablets, inscribed with a mysterious script we now call Linear B. These fragile records, baked hard and preserved by the very fires that destroyed the palaces around 1200 BCE, would become the key to unlocking a lost chapter in human history, proving that the world of the Trojan War was not merely a poet's dream, but a real, functioning, complex society. The story of their discovery is as dramatic as the civilization they record. The first major cache was unearthed in the year 1900 by the famed archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans at the Palace of Knossos on Crete. Evans, who had discovered the even older and utterly magnificent Minoan civilization, found these tablets and recognized they were written in a script different from the hieroglyphic-like writing he called Linear A. He named this new script Linear B. For decades, these tiny tablets covered in intricate, stylized signs were one of the world's greatest intellectual puzzles. Scholars across the globe tried and failed to crack the code. They knew these marks represented a language, but which one? Was it a unique Minoan tongue unrelated to any other known language? Was it something else entirely? The mystery deepened when, decades later, similar tablets were found not just on Crete, but on the Greek mainland at the Palace of Pylos, the legendary home of King Nestor, and at Mycenae itself, the citadel of Agamemnon. This geographical spread hinted that Linear B was not confined to the Minoans, but was the writing system of the wider Mycenaean world. The race to decipher it became a scholarly grail, a seemingly impossible challenge that captivated some of the brightest minds of the 20th century. The man who finally solved the riddle was not a dusty academic tucked away in a university library, but a young, brilliant, and tragically short-lived English architect named Michael Ventris. Ventris had been fascinated by the script since he was a schoolboy, and he approached the problem with the meticulous, structural mind of an architect. He worked not with a single lucky guess, but with a systematic, almost mathematical methodology, treating the script as a complex code. He and a small group of collaborators, including the philologist John Chadwick, began by analyzing the patterns in the signs. They noticed that certain groups of signs appeared repeatedly, almost like headings, at the beginning of tablets found in different locations. They theorized these might be the names of places. Then came the breakthrough. Ventris made a working hypothesis, a grid, where he assigned potential phonetic values to the signs based on their frequency and position. He assumed tentatively that the language might be an early form of Greek. It was a radical idea at the time, as most scholars believed the Mycenaeans predated Greek speakers. Then, in one of the most electrifying moments in modern scholarship, the grid began to work. Ventris tested his hypothesis on a series of tablets from Knossos that seemed to list commodities and ideograms for chariots and their parts. Using his proposed values, the words began to form recognizable Greek terms. He saw words like tai-rai, po for tripus, the Greek word for tripod, and kai-tu for quiton, a type of tunic. The evidence mounted rapidly and became undeniable. In 1952, Ventris announced his success on a BBC radio broadcast, sending shockwaves through the archaeological and linguistic world. He had done the impossible. He had proven that the language of the Linear B tablets was unequivocally an archaic dialect of Greek. pushing the confirmed history of the Greek language back by at least 500 years from the time of Homer to the middle of the Bronze Age. So, what did these deciphered tablets actually say? Were they epic poems celebrating the deeds of heroes? Were they royal chronicles of kings and their conquests? The answer is both more mundane and, in its own way, far more illuminating. The Linear B tablets are almost exclusively administrative records. They are the dry, bureaucratic paperwork of the Mycenaean palace economies, the kind of documents meant for short-term use and then typically discarded. They were only preserved because the palaces were destroyed by fire, which ironically baked the clay, making them more durable than they were ever intended to be. They record inventories of chariot wheels, swords, and suits of armor. They list quantities of wool, linen, grain, olives, and olive oil, all carefully measured and accounted for. They track the disbursement of rations to workers, from bronze smiths to shepherds. We see the names of slaves, their origins noted, often from places across the Aegean, showing this was a world of trade, contact, and unfortunately, human trafficking. One famous tablet from Pylos lists contributions of gold from various towns for some kind of religious offering, giving us a snapshot of the palace's regional influence and its intricate religious obligations. This mountain of bureaucratic detail allows us to reconstruct the Mycenaean world not as a myth, but as a highly centralized and organized state, what scholars call a redistributive palace economy. The palace, or wanax, the word for king that appears on the tablets, was the absolute center of everything. All production flowed into the palace's storerooms, and all distribution flowed out from it. Scribes, who were likely highly trained officials, kept track of every single commodity. They noted how much wool was given to a textile worker and how much cloth was expected in return. They recorded the number of sheep in vast flocks owned by the palace. They even kept personnel files. This was a society obsessed with inventory control, a complex, stratified, and efficient machine. We find no personal letters, no literature, no expressions of individual thought. The voices are silent, but the system speaks volumes about a culture capable of immense logistical organization, the very kind of organization that could muster a fleet for an expedition to Troy. The historical significance of this decipherment cannot be overstated. It created a tangible, written bridge across what was once called the Greek Dark Ages, the centuries of apparent cultural decline following the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces. Before Ventris, this period was a void, a rupture in the story of Greece. After his work, we could see an unbroken thread of linguistic and cultural continuity. The Greek of the Linear B tablets, while archaic, contains the direct ancestors of words used by Homer, by Plato, and that are still used today. The name Alexandra appears. The word for king, wanax, echoes in Homer's epithet Anaxandron, lord of men. The word for a military follower, hequetas on the tablets, is a clear precursor to the classical Greek heteros or companion. Even the names of gods appear, proving that the Mycenaeans were already worshipping deities who would become the core of the Greek pantheon. We see Poseidon, the earth shaker, appearing as a major figure, perhaps even more prominent than Zeus at this early date. We see Hera, Artemis, and Dionysos, whose name appears on a tablet from Pylos, proving his worship in Greece was far more ancient than previously believed. The Linear B tablets, therefore, are a profound testament to the resilience of culture. They show us that when the great palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Knossos fell to fire and invasion around 1200 BCE, they did not vanish without a trace. Their people survived, their language survived, their stories and gods survived, passed down orally through the generations, morphing and evolving, until they were finally written down again centuries later as the epic poems we know today. These humble clay inventories prove that the world of classical Greece did not spring from nothing. It grew from the deep, rich soil of a Bronze Age civilization, a civilization that kept its records not in stone monuments, but in the fragile clay that recorded the daily, practical business of life. They are the quiet, bureaucratic heartbeat of Homer's heroic age. But as the voices of the Mycenaean bureaucrats fall silent, we travel south to a culture obsessed not with the ledgers of this life, but with the meticulous preparation for the next. The pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom were a royal privilege, spells carved in stone for the pharaoh alone. 1,000 years later, this exclusive celestial roadmap had undergone a revolution. It was no longer reserved for kings, but was available for a price to anyone who could afford a copy. This is the world of the Book of the Dead, a collection of magical spells written on papyrus scrolls and placed in the tombs of elite Egyptians during the New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BC. Imagine a wealthy official or a noblewoman having lived a full life, now facing the ultimate journey. Beside their mummified body, within their coffin or in a specially made canopic chest, lay their most precious possession, a personalized guidebook to eternity. It was their passport, their map, and their cheat sheet for navigating the terrifying and wondrous landscape of the afterlife. The most famous of these is the magnificent Papyrus of Ani, a 23-meter-long scroll created for the royal scribe Ani and his wife Tutu around 1250 BC. Unrolled today in the British Museum, it is a breathtaking fusion of art and text, a vibrant, illustrated manuscript whose colors remain startlingly vivid after more than 3,000 years. This was not a single, standardized book in the modern sense, but rather a collection of nearly 200 known spells from which a person would select a customized set. A priest or scribe would consult with the individual or their family, choosing the spells deemed most necessary for their specific needs and budget. The result was a deeply personal document, often adorned with a portrait of the deceased and their name woven throughout the text. The core purpose of these spells was to equip the soul, or Ba, with the knowledge and power to overcome a series of obstacles. The papyrus provided the words to activate magical gates, pacify hostile demons, and transform the deceased into divine beings. One spell might allow a person to transform into a lotus flower, a snake, or a heron. Another, perhaps the most famous, was the spell for not dying a second time, ensuring the soul's survival in the afterlife. These texts were a form of spiritual technology, a collection of proven formulas that, if correctly recited, guaranteed a favorable outcome. The illustrations or vignettes which ran along the top of the papyrus were not mere decorations. They were active components of the magic, visualizing the gods, the landscapes, and the rituals described in the spells, making them real and potent. The climax of this post-mortem journey, and the central scene depicted in virtually every Book of the Dead, is the Judgment of the Dead. This is where the Egyptian concept of morality and the afterlife converge in one of the most dramatic and influential ideas in human religious history. The vignette shows the Hall of Mot, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. The deceased is led by the god Anubis to a giant scale. On one scale sits their heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and morality. On the other side rests the feather of Mot, symbolizing truth and righteousness. The goal was for the heart to be in perfect balance with the feather. If it was heavier, weighed down by misdeeds, the soul faced annihilation. A monstrous creature known as Ammit, the devourer of the dead, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, waited nearby to consume the unbalanced heart. But the Book of the Dead gave the deceased the tools to pass this test. A special spell, often labeled as Spell 30B, was provided to prevent the heart from speaking against its owner. It was a plea directed at the heart itself. "O my heart, which I had from my mother, do not stand up as a witness against me, do not be opposed to me in the tribunal, do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance." This was not an admission of guilt, but a magical safeguard against any potential failure of memory or character at this most critical moment. This scene of judgment reveals a profound shift in Egyptian religious thought. In the earlier pyramid texts, the pharaoh's ascent was a divine right, achieved through power and command. Here, in the Book of the Dead, entry into the afterlife was contingent upon moral fitness. To prove their worth, the deceased would then recite a lengthy declaration, known today as the negative confession. Standing before a tribunal of 42 gods, the soul would address each one by name and deny having committed a specific sin. "I have not done evil," they would proclaim. "I have not robbed, I have not stolen, I have not killed men, I have not told lies, I have not caused pain. I have not committed adultery, I have not been deaf to words of truth." This list provides a fascinating window into New Kingdom Egyptian ethics, outlining a code of conduct that valued social harmony, truthfulness, and respect for property and the gods. Success in this judgment meant the ultimate reward. The god of wisdom, Thoth, would record the result, and the deceased would be presented to the enthroned king of the underworld, Osiris. Having been declared true of voice, they would be welcomed into the blissful, eternal fields of reeds, a perfect, idealized mirror of the Egyptian Nile Valley, where they would live forever in a state of perfected existence. The democratization of the afterlife represented by these papyri is one of their most significant legacies. By the New Kingdom, the belief that every soul could achieve immortality was not just a hope, but an expectation for the elite and increasingly for the middle class. This was a spiritual revolution. The intricate rituals and powerful spells once reserved for the son of Ra were now available to scribes, priests, and craftsmen. This shift speaks to a growing sense of personal piety and individual responsibility in one's relationship with the gods. A person's fate was no longer solely determined by their social status in life or by the efficacy of the state priesthood, but by the moral quality of their own heart and their personal investment in acquiring the magical means for salvation. The Book of the Dead papyri are therefore far more than ancient religious curiosities. They are intimate documents of human hope and anxiety. They represent the ultimate convergence of art, magic, religion, and personal ambition, capturing the universal human desire to believe that our actions matter, that our soul is judged, and that death is not an end but a gateway to a perfected world. Our journey now takes us north from the Egyptian Nile and the Mycenaean citadels to a bustling port city on the coast of what is now Syria. Known today as Ras Shamra, this was the ancient city of Ugarit, a major hub of international trade and culture during the late Bronze Age. It was a cosmopolitan crossroads where merchants from the Hittite Empire, Egypt, Cyprus, and Mycenaean Greece would have mingled in its harbors and markets. In 1928, a Syrian farmer plowing his field accidentally struck the roof of a long-buried tomb, triggering one of the most important archaeological discoveries for understanding the ancient Near East. French archaeologists soon began excavating the site, and what they uncovered was nothing short of a literary treasure trove. The royal palace and temple libraries of Ugarit filled with thousands of clay tablets. These weren't just any tablets, they were inscribed in a unique script that would unlock a lost world of myth and religion, a world that stands directly in the background of the Hebrew Bible. What makes the Ugaritic text so revolutionary is their script. By the 14th century BCE, the cumbersome cuneiform writing system of Mesopotamia, with its hundreds of complex signs, was the dominant form of record-keeping for diplomacy and administration across the region. But the scribes of Ugarit performed an act of brilliant innovation. They looked at the concept of the alphabet, a relatively new invention emerging in the Sinai and Canon, and they married it to the familiar medium of clay and stylus. They developed a completely new writing system, a 30-sign alphabetic cuneiform. This was a stunningly efficient compromise. Instead of learning hundreds of syllabic signs, a scribe only had to master around 30 characters that represented the consonants of their own Northwest Semitic language. This made writing faster to learn and more accessible, and it is the oldest known alphabet to be written in cuneiform. These tablets, dating from approximately 1400 to 1200 BC, preserve the entire spectrum of Ugaritic life, from mundane administrative lists tracking shipments of wine and olive oil to detailed legal documents and personal letters that give us the voices of ordinary people. Yet, the true crown jewels of the Ugaritic archives are the literary and mythological texts. These tablets preserve an entire cycle of epic poetry and religious narrative that had been completely lost to history. The most significant of these is the Baal cycle, a series of tablets that recount the dramatic struggles of the Canaanite storm god Baal-Hadad for supremacy over the cosmos. This is not a dry theological treatise. It is powerful, vibrant, and often brutal epic poetry, filled with vivid imagery and cosmic conflict. The cycle begins with Baal's challenge to the tyrannical rule of the sea god Yam, who represents the chaotic, untamed waters. In a great battle, Baal, with the help of master craftsman gods, fashions two magical clubs named Driver and Chaser and defeats Yam, establishing order over chaos. This victory allows Baal to claim his kingship among the gods and to have a magnificent palace built for him on his sacred mountain, Mount Zaphon. But Baal's trials are not over. No sooner has he established his rule than he must confront a far more sinister and inevitable foe, Mot, the god of death and the underworld. Mot, whose name literally means death, is a terrifying force of nature representing sterility, drought, and the barrenness of summer. He taunts Baal, demanding that the storm god, the source of life giving rain and fertility, must descend into his gullet, into the dark recesses of the earth. In a heartbreaking scene, Baal, knowing he cannot ultimately defeat death, submits. He mates with a heifer in a final act of procreation and then descends into the underworld. His death causes a cosmic crisis. The rains stop, the vegetation withers, and the world falls into mourning. The goddess Anat, Baal's violent and devoted sister, will not accept this fate. She travels to the underworld, finds Mot, and in a scene of shocking violence, she seizes Mot. With a sword she splits him, with a sieve she winnows him, with fire she burns him, with millstones she grinds him, in the field she sows him. This graphic dismemberment of death itself allows Baal to be resurrected, and the life-giving rains return to the earth, restoring the fertile cycle of the seasons. The theological and literary importance of the Baal cycle cannot be overstated, especially for our understanding of the cultural environment from which ancient Israel emerged. The language of Ugaritic is incredibly close to Biblical Hebrew, and the literary themes and poetic structures are directly parallel. When you read the descriptions of God in the Psalms, triumphing over the sea monster Leviathan or Rahab, you are hearing echoes of Baal's battle with Yam. The very concept of God as a rider on the clouds, a description used for Yahweh in the Psalms, is a title that belongs to Baal in the Ugaritic texts. The word for Baal's temple, his house, is Hekul, the same word used for the temple in Jerusalem. The head of the Canaanite pantheon was the elderly god El, who is depicted as a wise, bearded patriarch dwelling in a tent at the source of the rivers. The name El is, of course, the very word for God in Biblical Hebrew and is used in the names of archangels like Gabriel and Michael, and even in the name Israel, which means he who struggles with God. This shows that early Israelite religion was not created in a vacuum, but was in a dynamic dialogue and often a polemical argument with its Canaanite neighbors. The biblical prophets constantly railed against the worship of Baal, precisely because it was such a powerful and attractive rival to the worship of Yahweh. To read the Ugaritic texts is to see the raw mythological material that the biblical authors were consciously reshaping to fit their own revolutionary vision of a single, universal God who transcends nature and is not subject to a cycle of death and rebirth. Beyond the grand cosmic myths, the tablets from Ugarit provide an intimate, ground-level view of a vibrant, complex society, right up to the moment of its collapse around 1200 BC. We have legal texts that outline the rights of women, including their ability to own and inherit property. We have letters from merchants arranging complex international shipments. We have administrative records that list the names of hundreds of people, giving us a snapshot of a diverse population. There is even a text that appears to be a veterinary manual for treating ailing horses, a crucial document for a society whose military depended on chariots. The city's end was sudden and violent, part of the wider Late Bronze Age collapse that also toppled the Hittite Empire and shattered the Mycenaean palaces. The Ugaritic tablets, therefore, are a frozen moment in time, preserving the last thoughts, records, and prayers of a civilization that thrived at the crossroads of the world. They give us the myths that gave their world meaning, the laws that gave it order, and the letters that recorded its daily life, all captured in a unique script on clay tablets that have whispered their secrets across 3,000 years. Beyond the coastal trade of Ugarit, deep in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, lay the heart of another Bronze Age superpower. The city of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, was not a coastal metropolis but a formidable fortress city, its massive stone walls and monumental gateways built to impress and intimidate. For centuries, its power was known only from scattered references in Egyptian and Mesopotamian records, a shadowy kingdom lurking in the northern mountains. That all changed in the early 20th century with the excavations at the site of modern-day Bogaskale in Turkey. There, archaeologists uncovered not just the ruins of a great city, but something far more valuable, the Hittite state archives. This was not a small collection. It was a mountain of information, tens of thousands of clay tablets, meticulously stored in the palace and temple complexes, written in a multitude of languages including Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, and Hittite itself, the oldest recorded Indo-European language. These tablets, dating from the 14th to the 13th centuries BC, did not just tell us about the Hittites. They gave the empire its voice, revealing a society of astonishing legal sophistication, deep religious piety, and immense military and diplomatic clout. Among these countless records, one tablet stands out for its profound historical significance. It is a document that encapsulates a pivotal moment in international relations, a moment where two superpowers chose diplomacy over endless war. This is the Treaty of Kadesh, forged in around 1259 BC between the Hittite great king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. The story leading to this treaty was one of colossal ambition and a near-disastrous battle. Ramesses II had marched his army into Syria to reclaim the city of Kadesh from the Hittite sphere of influence. What followed was a legendary confrontation. The Egyptian accounts, glorified on the walls of temples like Abu Simbel, portray Ramesses as a lone hero, single-handedly turning the tide against a treacherous Hittite ambush. The reality, pieced together from the Hittite archives, suggests a much more complex and less decisive battle, one that ended in a stalemate with heavy losses on both sides. Neither empire could deliver a knockout blow. After years of continued posturing and conflict, both rulers realized that perpetual war was unsustainable. Exhaustion and mutual self-interest paved the way for a revolutionary idea, a formal, lasting peace. The treaty itself is a masterpiece of statecraft. Remarkably, we have both the Hittite and Egyptian versions, carved in hieroglyphs on the walls of the Karnak and Ramesseum temples in Egypt and preserved on baked clay tablets in Hattusa. Its terms are a fascinating blend of pragmatic politics and divine sanction. The two kings mutually agreed to renounce aggression forever. They pledged a defensive alliance, vowing to come to each other's aid if attacked by a third party or if internal rebellions threatened their thrones. They agreed to extradite political fugitives who fled across their borders, a crucial clause for maintaining internal stability. But this was more than a political contract. It was a religious oath sworn before the 1,000 gods of the Hittites and the 1,000 gods of Egypt. The treaty explicitly calls these deities as witnesses, warning that anyone who breaks the oath would be destroyed by the gods, while those who keep it would be blessed. This divine enforcement mechanism was the ultimate guarantee in the Bronze Age world. The Treaty of Kadesh is the oldest known written peace treaty in human history, and its spirit of mutual recognition and non-aggression between equals resonates as a timeless diplomatic ideal. A symbolic copy of this very treaty even hangs today at the United Nations headquarters, a direct link from the halls of Hattusa to the modern pursuit of international peace. Beyond this singular diplomatic achievement, the Hittite archives reveal an empire governed by a highly developed and systematic legal code. The Hittite laws, recorded on numerous tablets, show a society that, while harsh by modern standards, often displayed a surprising emphasis on restitution and proportionality over brute retaliation. Unlike Hammurabi's code with its strict eye for an eye, the Hittites frequently preferred fines and compensation. For instance, if a person killed another in a quarrel, the law demanded they give the victim's family 4 persons as restitution. If it was an accident, the penalty was only 2 persons. This seems brutal to us, but the principle was to restore a balance to the community rather than simply inflict a matching injury. The laws cover everything from assault and theft to agriculture and marriage. The penalty for stealing a beehive was a fine of honey, a beautifully logical punishment. They had specific regulations for the prices of commodities, wages for various professions, and the responsibilities of landowners. The legal status of women is particularly revealing. Hittite women could own property in their own name, initiate divorce, and engage in business. In marriage, a woman did not become her husband's property. She brought a dowry, and if the marriage ended through no fault of hers, she was entitled to take her dowry and leave, a level of economic protection that was remarkable for the ancient world. The religious life of the Hittites, as detailed in the tablet archives, was incredibly complex and inclusive, reflecting the diverse nature of their empire. The Hittite pantheon was a vast and crowded assembly of deities, often described as the 1,000 gods of Hatti. This was not an exaggeration. As the Hittites expanded, they did not suppress the gods of the people they conquered. Instead, they adopted them, weaving the deities of Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia into their own state religion. The storm god Tahana stood at the head of this divine crowd, but his supremacy was not absolute. The archives are filled with detailed ritual texts that read like meticulous instruction manuals for priests. These texts prescribe exactly how to perform sacrifices, which animals to offer, what words to recite, and even what specific types of bread to bake for which god. We find rituals for everything from the grand national festivals that secured the favor of the gods for the entire kingdom to highly specific purification rites for individuals. There are exorcism rituals to drive out evil spirits and substitute king, rituals where a stand-in would temporarily wear the crown to absorb an evil omen predicted for the real monarch, who would then be discreetly killed after the danger had passed. This deep well of ritual text shows a society that believed the cosmos was governed by a complex, contractual relationship between humans and gods, a relationship that required constant and precise maintenance to ensure the stability of the state and the fertility of the land. The sheer administrative scale of the Hittite archives is a testament to the empire's bureaucratic power. These thousands of tablets were the central nervous system of a far-flung dominion. They contain royal edicts, correspondence with vassal kings, military reports from frontier forts, and detailed inventories of temple and palace treasuries. We can read the royal annals of great kings like Suppiluliuma I, who transformed the Hittites into a dominant empire, and follow their military campaigns season by season. The archives also preserve a rich literary tradition, including Hittite translations and adaptations of Mesopotamian epics like Gilgamesh, and their own mythological cycles, such as the tale of the god Telepinu, whose disappearance causes all fertility on Earth to cease, a story echoing the themes of the Ugaritic Baal cycle. The end of this great empire is as dramatic as its history. Around 1200 BCE, in the widespread chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, Hattusa was violently destroyed, abandoned, and burned. The fires that consumed the city, however, had an unintended consequence. They baked and hardened the clay tablets, preserving the entire state archives for over 3,000 years. The Hittites vanished from history, becoming little more than a name in the Bible, until their own words were dug from the earth, allowing this formidable, complex, and deeply religious civilization to reclaim its rightful place as one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Now we travel forward in time and into the harsh, arid landscape of the Judean desert, to a discovery that would utterly transform our understanding of the Bible and the world from which it emerged. In the late 1940s, a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a rock into a cave opening near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Instead of the sound of a scurrying animal, he heard the shattering of pottery. Venturing inside, he found several tall, cylindrical clay jars. Inside those jars were not treasures of gold or silver, but something far more precious, ancient leather and papyrus scrolls blackened with age. This accidental discovery and the subsequent decade of archaeological searches in what are known as the Qumran caves would yield one of the 20th century's greatest archaeological sensations, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was not a single manuscript but a vast library hidden away in 11 caves, containing over 900 documents and tens of thousands of fragments, all dating from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century CE. This was a time of immense religious and political ferment, the very era that gave birth to both rabbinic Judaism and Christianity. The contents of this library can be broadly divided into two categories, each with earth-shaking implications. The first, and perhaps most significant for Western civilization, is the biblical manuscripts. Before the discovery at Qumran, the oldest complete Hebrew copies of the books of the Bible, such as the Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, dated to the 10th and 11th centuries CE. There was a 1,000-year gap between these medieval manuscripts and the original composition of the texts. Scholars could only theorize about what changes, errors, or intentional edits might have occurred during that vast span of time. The Dead Sea Scrolls collapsed that gap. They provided Hebrew manuscripts of the biblical books that were more than 1,000 years older than anything previously known. The most spectacular of these is the Great Isaiah Scroll, a breathtakingly complete copy of the entire book of Isaiah, written on 17 sheets of parchment sewn end to end, measuring over 7 meters long. Unrolling this scroll was like looking over the shoulder of the scribe who copied it 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus. Its text is remarkably similar to the traditional Masoretic text that forms the basis of our modern Old Testament, a finding that provided stunning confirmation of the accuracy of the scribbled tradition over a millennium. Yet, it also contains fascinating differences, small variations in wording, spelling, and even the arrangement of some verses, that give scholars a dynamic view of a text that was still, in some ways, being finalized. But the second category of scrolls is perhaps even more fascinating, pulling back the curtain on a mysterious and radical Jewish community that lived by the Dead Sea. These are the sectarian manuscripts, the rule books, hymns, and commentaries composed by the group itself, widely believed to be the Essenes, a strict, ascetic Jewish sect described by ancient historians like Josephus. The most important of these is the Community Rule, also known as the Manual of Discipline. This scroll is the constitution for a radical religious brotherhood. It lays out in painstaking detail the requirements for joining the community, the years of probation, the strict code of conduct, and the shared ownership of all property. It describes a dualistic worldview, a cosmic struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, with the community seeing itself as the faithful remnant, the true Israel, waiting for an imminent apocalyptic war in which God and his angels would grant them victory. The text outlines their daily life of ritual purity, common meals, and intense study of the law, governed by a rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience to the community's leaders. Another profoundly influential sectarian text is the Pesher on Habakkuk, a unique style of biblical commentary. The author takes the ancient prophecies of the prophet Habakkuk and interprets them as being directly fulfilled in the events of his own time. The text is filled with cryptic references to figures known only by titles: the teacher of righteousness, the community's inspired leader, the wicked priest, his persecutor, and the man of lies, his opponent. This practice of finding hidden, contemporary meanings in ancient scripture reveals a community living in a state of high tension, believing that they were the final generation, interpreting every current event through the lens of prophecy. They saw the Roman occupation and the corrupt priesthood in Jerusalem not just as political problems, but as the unfolding of a divine, end-times drama in which they played the central role. The impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls on our understanding of early Christianity has been the subject of intense study and sometimes heated debate. The parallels are undeniably striking. Here was a Jewish community practicing ritual baptism, sharing communal meals, holding all possessions in common, and following a new covenant in the land of Damascus. Their teacher of righteousness was a messianic figure who was persecuted, and they awaited a coming prophet and two messiahs, one royal and one priestly. This world of intense apocalyptic expectation, of a community separating itself from a corrupt religious establishment, is the exact same cultural and religious milieu in which John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth emerged. The scrolls do not mention Jesus or his followers, nor do they contain any Christian doctrine. Rather, they provide the indispensable Jewish backdrop, proving that many ideas once thought to be unique to Christianity were, in fact, circulating within diverse strands of Judaism at the time. Jesus' teachings would have sounded both revolutionary and familiar to an audience aware of groups like the Essenes. The scrolls demolish the old idea of a monolithic Judaism and reveal a vibrant tapestry of competing interpretations, a world of spiritual seeking and fervent expectation into which Christianity was born as one of several Jewish renewal movements. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is also a modern drama of scholarship, secrecy, and controversy. For decades after their discovery, a small, exclusive international team of scholars controlled access to the thousands of fragments, publishing their findings at a notoriously slow pace. This created an academic monopoly that fueled conspiracy theories and frustrations, with critics accusing the team of hiding texts that might challenge traditional religious beliefs. It wasn't until the 1990s, after pressure from the academic community and new technological initiatives, that the entire corpus was finally photographed and released to the world, allowing a new generation of scholars from diverse backgrounds to study them. This delay, followed by the flood of new research, only underscores the scrolls' immense power. They are not relics frozen in time, but active participants in an ongoing conversation about history, faith, and the origins of the Western religious tradition. They give us the voices of a devout, radical community who withdrew into the desert to prepare for God's final judgment, and in doing so, they left behind a library that would force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the Bible. But while the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved the Hebrew Bible in the land of its birth, a parallel and equally momentous story was unfolding in the great intellectual capital of the ancient world, Alexandria, Egypt. Here, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a profound linguistic and cultural shift was taking place. Greek was the language of commerce, government, and learning across the eastern Mediterranean, and a large community of Greek-speaking Jews had settled in Alexandria. Over generations, their knowledge of the ancestral Hebrew language was fading, creating a spiritual crisis. How could they remain faithful to the law of Moses if they could no longer read it? The legend recorded in the letter of Aristeas tells of a solution both pragmatic and miraculous. The Greek king of Egypt, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, was persuaded to sponsor a grand project, the translation of the Hebrew Torah into Greek for his famous library of Alexandria. He summoned 72 elders, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and placed them in 72 separate rooms on the island of Pharaohs. Working independently, they all produced identical, perfect Greek translations. From this story of divine inspiration, the translation derived its name, the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. Whether the miraculous details are true or not, the historical reality is that the Hebrew Bible was indeed translated into Greek over the course of the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. This was not a single event but a gradual, scholarly process. The Septuagint, often abbreviated as LXX, became the scripture for the vast diaspora of Greek-speaking Jews. And its importance was about to become exponentially greater, for it would become the first and primary Bible of the earliest Christian church. The apostles and the writers of the New Testament were Greek speakers. When they quoted scripture, when they argued theology, when they preached to the Gentile world, it was the Septuagint they used. This means that the foundational texts of Christianity are inextricably linked to this Greek translation, not the later standardized Hebrew text. The oldest physical evidence for this world-altering text comes from a tiny, fragile fragment known as the Rylands Library Papyrus P52. Discovered in Egypt and now housed in Manchester, England, this scrap of papyrus is smaller than a credit card. It contains a few verses from the Gospel of John on one side, dating to around 125 to 150 of the Common Era, making it the oldest known fragment of the New Testament. But why is it relevant to the Septuagint? Because it demonstrates the textual environment of early Christianity, a world of Greek manuscripts circulating among communities that relied on the Greek Old Testament. P52 is a tangible whisper from the era when the Septuagint was the living, breathing scripture of the burgeoning Christian faith. For more substantial witnesses to the Septuagint text, we must leap forward a few centuries to the great, majestic biblical codices. The invention of the codex, the book with pages as opposed to the scroll, was a revolution in information technology, and Christianity embraced it wholeheartedly. In the 4th century of the Common Era, following the Emperor Constantine's conversion, the Church had the resources and the need to produce definitive, complete copies of the Christian Bible, which included the Septuagint as its Old Testament. 2 colossal manuscripts stand above all others, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Vaticanus, residing in the Vatican Library since at least the 15th century, is a magnificent volume written in elegant, unadorned Greek capital letters. It originally contained the entire Greek Bible, the Septuagint, and the New Testament, in a single massive book of around 1,600 pages crafted from fine vellum. Its text is considered by many scholars to be one of the most accurate and reliable surviving witnesses to the original Septuagint translation. For centuries, however, it was essentially locked away in the Vatican, a hidden treasure whose contents were a subject of intense speculation and frustration for Protestant scholars, creating an aura of mystery that still surrounds it today. The story of its sibling, Codex Sinaiticus, reads like an archaeological adventure novel. In the year 1844, a German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf was visiting the remote monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai. He noticed a basket of old parchment leaves waiting to be burned as trash. To his astonishment, he recognized them as pages from an ancient Greek Bible. He managed to save these 43 leaves. Convinced more of the manuscript survived, he returned years later and, in a controversial episode, secured the main body of the codex from the monks, presenting it to the Russian Tsar. This complete manuscript, written around the same time as Vaticanus in the mid-4th century, is a breathtaking work. It is the earliest complete copy of the New Testament and contains a large portion of the Septuagint. Sinaiticus is also a palimpsest of history itself. Its pages contain corrections made by different scribes over the centuries, allowing us to see the very process of textual transmission and standardization as it happened. The codex was later purchased from the Soviet Union by the British Museum in 1933 for £100,000, a staggering sum at the time, underscoring its immense value. Together, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus provide the textual backbone for nearly every modern critical edition of the Greek Bible, serving as the gold standard against which all other manuscripts are measured. The scholarly importance of these Septuagint manuscripts cannot be overstated, for they reveal a Bible that is sometimes startlingly different from the one preserved in the later Hebrew tradition. When the Septuagint was translated in the centuries before the Common Era, it was based on Hebrew source texts that were often older and variant from the ones that would later be standardized by the Masoretes. This means the Septuagint preserves an alternative, and in many cases older, version of many biblical stories. The Book of Jeremiah in the Septuagint, for example, is about 1/8 shorter than the Hebrew version, and the chapters are in a different order. The Book of Job is significantly shorter, and then there are entire books that are found in the Septuagint but were not included in the final Hebrew canon. For Protestants, these are the Apocrypha books like Judith, Tobit, the Wisdom of Solomon, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. For the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches, these books remain part of the canonical Old Testament. The very existence of these books, preserved only in Greek, is a direct result of the Septuagint tradition. They provide invaluable historical and theological insight into the Jewish world during the crucial period between the Old and New Testaments, the world of the Second Temple. So, when a modern reader opens a Catholic Bible and finds the story of the Maccabean Revolt, they are reading a text that survives only because it was included in the Septuagint and then passed down through Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Ultimately, the Septuagint manuscripts represent a monumental crossroads of culture, faith, and language. They are the bridge between the world of ancient Israel and the Greco-Roman world, the vessel that carried the God of Abraham into the minds of Plato's philosophical descendants. For the first Christians, it was the Septuagint's rendering of Hebrew prophecies that became their primary proof texts for arguing that Jesus was the Messiah. The most famous example is the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. The Hebrew text uses the word Alma, which can mean a young woman of marriageable age. The Septuagint translators, however, chose the specific Greek word Parthenos, which unambiguously means virgin. It is this Greek translation, "a virgin shall conceive," that is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew and which became a central tenet of Christian doctrine. This single translational choice, preserved on the vellum of the great codices, shaped 2,000 years of theology. The Septuagint was, in a very real sense, the first Christian Bible, and its oldest manuscripts are the physical anchors of that tradition. They remind us that the Bible is not a single, monolithic text that fell from heaven, but a living, breathing library of books whose journey through different languages, cultures, and manuscripts is an integral part of its profound and enduring story. While the great biblical codices of the 4th century were being created under imperial sponsorship, codifying the texts that would become the Orthodox Christian canon, a very different kind of library was being buried in the Egyptian desert, a collection that would challenge our very understanding of early Christianity. Our next manuscript discovery takes us to the year 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. A group of local farmers were digging for fertilizer at the base of a cliff when one of their hoes struck something hard. It wasn't a rock but a large, sealed clay jar. Hesitant at first, fearing a jinn might be inside, they eventually broke it open. They hoped to find gold, but what they discovered was arguably more valuable: 13 leather-bound books or codices filled with ancient papyrus pages. They had unearthed a time capsule, not from the world of emperors and state-sanctioned bishops, but from the world of early Christian mystics, heretics, and seekers. This was the Nag Hammadi library. These 13 codices, plus a few leaves from another, contain 52 separate texts, all translated from Greek into the Coptic language and hidden away in the 4th century, likely by monks from a nearby monastery seeking to protect these controversial writings from destruction by the rising tide of orthodox enforcement. The world they reveal is not the unified, hierarchical Christianity that would come to dominate Europe. Instead, it is a vibrant, chaotic, and intensely diverse spiritual landscape, a world of what scholars now call Gnostic Christianity. The term Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which does not mean rational knowledge, but rather a deep, intuitive, revelatory knowledge of God and the true nature of reality. For the authors and readers of these texts, salvation was not achieved through faith alone or by the sacrifice of Christ, but through this direct, personal awakening to the divine spark within oneself. This was a Christianity of inner enlightenment, a path that viewed the material world not as a glorious creation of a benevolent God, but as a tragic mistake, a prison from which the soul needed to escape. Perhaps the most famous text in the entire collection is the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are narrative accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the Gospel of Thomas is simply a list. It begins, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded." What follows are 114 sayings, or logia, of Jesus, with no story, no miracles, and no mention of the crucifixion. It is a collection of enigmatic, often paradoxical teachings designed to provoke insight. Saying 77 reads, "Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me there." This presents a Jesus who is not a distant savior but an immanent, pervasive presence in all of creation. Another saying, the second, states, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished and he will rule over the all." This is a map of the spiritual journey itself, seeking, turmoil, awe, and finally, sovereign understanding. The Gospel of Thomas places the entire burden of salvation on the individual's quest for understanding, suggesting the kingdom of God is not a future reward but a present state of perception available to those who can decipher these mysteries. Another text, the Gospel of Philip, reads less like a gospel and more like a theological notebook, a collection of mystical reflections on sacraments, sexuality, and salvation. It is famous for a passage that has sparked endless speculation and controversy, which speaks of a special relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It says, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Savior loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth." While modern interpretations often leap to a physical relationship, the context of the text suggests a spiritual and symbolic meaning. In this worldview, a kiss represented the transfer of divine spirit and wisdom. Mary is presented as the disciple who truly understands Jesus' secret teachings, making her the model Gnostic, in contrast to the obtuse and bickering male disciples like Peter, who represents the emerging Orthodox Church. The text laments, "They said to him, 'Why do you love her more than all of us?' The Savior answered and said to them, 'Why do I not love you like her?'" This tension highlights a major conflict within early Christianity. Would it be a religion of an institutional, all-male hierarchy, or would it include a path of direct, mystical knowledge accessible to all, including women? Perhaps the most cosmologically ambitious text in the library is the Apocryphon of John, or the Secret Book of John. This text presents a complete and radical retelling of the Genesis creation story, a vast, complex myth that attempts to answer the fundamental question, if God is all good, why is the world so full of suffering and evil? The answer provided is both tragic and profound. It describes a perfect, transcendent, and utterly unknowable divine source called the monad. From this source emanates a series of divine beings called eons in increasing degrees of manifestation. One of the lowest of these, a being named Sophia, or Wisdom, desires to know the unknowable Father on her own without her divine counterpart. This arrogant, solitary thought results in a flawed, ignorant creation, a monstrous, lion-faced deity named Yaldabaoth, who is the god of the Old Testament. Blinded by his own pride and ignorance, Yaldabaoth declares, "It is I who am God, and there is no other." He then creates the material world as a flawed copy of the divine realm above, a prison for the divine light he unwittingly possesses. Humanity enters this drama when Yaldabaoth and his demonic assistants, the Archons, fashion the physical body of Adam. He is inert, a lump of clay, until the divine beings from the true God above trick Yaldabaoth into breathing his own stolen divine power into Adam, animating him with a spirit and making him superior to his creators. The rest of the biblical story is reinterpreted through this lens. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is not a tempter but a liberator, sent by Sophia to encourage Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge and thus awaken to their true divine nature, thwarting Yaldabaoth's plan to keep them in ignorant submission. The entire purpose of the Gnostic Christ, then, is to descend from the true God, enter the human Jesus, and bring the saving knowledge, the gnosis, that will remind humanity of its alien, celestial origin, and teach it how to navigate past the hostile archons after death to return to the pleroma, the fullness of the divine realm. When these texts were discovered, their impact on the study of early Christianity was seismic. For the first time, scholars had primary sources written by the so-called heretics themselves, not just the polemical refutations written by their orthodox opponents like Irenaeus of Lyons, who had written a work called Against Heresies in the 2nd century precisely to denounce these kinds of beliefs. The Nag Hammadi library proved that the battle for the soul of Christianity was not a minor skirmish but a fundamental struggle between vastly different worldviews. One side, which would become orthodoxy, emphasized faith, creed, apostolic authority, and the goodness of God's material creation, culminating in the physical resurrection of Jesus. The other side, represented by these codices, emphasized secret knowledge, personal spiritual experience, the inherent evil of the material world, and a salvation that was entirely spiritual, denying the physical resurrection. The existence of this library forces us to see the first few centuries of Christianity not as a straight line from Jesus to the Nicene Creed, but as a labyrinth of competing interpretations, a vibrant marketplace of ideas about who Jesus was and what his message truly meant. These 13 codices, buried in a jar to save them from the fire, are a testament to the roads not taken, the voices that were silenced but never entirely lost. Our journey through the ancient world now brings us to a small, unassuming object of baked clay, shaped like a football, with a story that resonates powerfully across 25 centuries. In 1879, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Babylon in modern-day Iraq uncovered this artifact, the Cyrus cylinder. Dating to 539 before the Common Era, this barrel-shaped document, inscribed in the familiar Akkadian cuneiform, records the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus II, the founder of the vast Persian Achaemenid Empire. But this was no typical victory monument, gloating over slaughtered enemies and smashed cities. Instead, it presents a radical new model of imperial rule, one grounded in pragmatism, propaganda, and a surprising degree of religious tolerance. It is a text that has led many to call it the first charter of human rights, a title that speaks to its enduring symbolic power, even as scholars debate the precise intentions behind its words. To understand the cylinder's revolutionary nature, we must first appreciate the world it overturned. The mighty Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nabonidus was in a state of deep religious and political crisis. Nabonidus was an eccentric ruler who had devoted himself to the moon god Sin, largely neglecting Babylon's chief patron deity, Marduk. The cylinder's text, written from the perspective of Cyrus, cleverly exploits this discontent. It paints Nabonidus as an impious tyrant who disrupted sacred rituals and oppressed his own people. It describes how Marduk, the king of the gods, searched all lands for a righteous ruler and found Cyrus, the king of Anshan, taking his hand and naming him to rule all the world. This was a masterstroke of political messaging. By claiming the mantle of Marduk's chosen liberator, Cyrus was not a foreign conqueror in the eyes of the Babylonians. He was a restorer of divine order, a savior returning their city to its proper relationship with its god. His peaceful entry into Babylon, welcomed by its own people, was the culmination of this brilliantly executed campaign. The most celebrated section of the text details the practical policies that followed this divine endorsement. Cyrus declares that he reversed Nabonidus's impious acts. He returned the statues of various gods to their home cities, along with their people who had been concentrated in Babylon. He restored the dilapidated temples and reinstituted the regular festivals and offerings that had lapsed. This was the heart of his new imperial strategy. Unlike the brutal Assyrians before him, who crushed rebellions through mass deportations and terror, Cyrus sought stability through cooperation and local autonomy. He allowed conquered peoples to return to their homelands, to worship their own gods according to their own traditions, and to live under their own local laws so long as they remained peaceful and paid their tribute to the Persian crown. This policy of enlightened self-interest created a stable, manageable empire, but it also had a profound human consequence. It meant that families and communities torn from their ancestral lands could finally go home. For one specific group of people, this policy was nothing short of world-altering. The cylinder does not mention them by name, but their own sacred scriptures record the event with awe and gratitude. These were the Jewish people who had been living in exile in Babylon since the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by King Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier. The biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles describe the moment explicitly. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. For the Jewish exiles, Cyrus was not merely a Persian king. He was the Mashiach, the Lord's anointed, a pagan monarch anointed by the God of Israel to be his instrument of deliverance. This decree allowed for the return to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the city walls, and ultimately the construction of the Second Temple, an event that reshaped the entire future of Judaism. Without Cyrus's policy, the religious and cultural trajectory of Judaism, and by extension the foundations of Christianity and Islam, would have been fundamentally different. The modern life of the Cyrus cylinder is a story in itself, transforming it from an archaeological curiosity into a global icon. In 1971, the United Nations marked the 2500th anniversary of the Persian monarchy by translating the cylinder into all of its official languages. The Shah of Iran celebrated it as a symbol of Iran's ancient tradition of justice and tolerance. This interpretation, while powerful, has been nuanced by modern scholarship. Academics point out that the cylinder is a deeply traditional Mesopotamian document in its form and rhetoric, following a long line of royal inscriptions where a new king legitimizes his rule by claiming to correct the abuses of his predecessor. The rights it grants are not universal, inalienable human rights as we conceive of them today, but rather the restoration of traditional privileges to specific communities within the empire. It was a tool of statecraft designed to secure the loyalty of diverse subject populations and ensure the steady flow of revenue to the imperial center. Yet to dismiss it for this reason is to miss its profound significance. In a world where the standard practice of empire was brutal subjugation, Cyrus chose a different path. He demonstrated that tolerance could be a more effective instrument of power than terror, that respecting the customs of conquered peoples could build a more resilient and prosperous realm. So, the true legacy of this small clay object lies in this powerful, enduring idea. It represents a pivotal moment when a ruler first articulated, in a public and lasting document, a philosophy of governance that valued cultural and religious diversity. It stands as a testament to an alternative vision of power, one that seeks to include rather than simply dominate. The cylinder itself resides today in the British Museum, a quiet witness to the ambitions of a great king. But its spirit, the spirit of allowing people to worship freely, to live under their own laws, and to return from exile, echoes through history. It connects the throne room of ancient Babylon to the hopes of displaced people in every age, reminding us that the most enduring conquests are not of land but of the human heart. Now we shift our perspective from the great imperial centers to a smaller, but no less significant, kingdom on the other side of the Jordan River. Here, a story of rebellion and national pride was carved not on a polished cylinder or a palace wall, but on a rough block of black basalt. Known as the Mesha stele or the Moabite stone, this monument stands as one of the most dramatic and important inscriptions ever discovered for understanding the world of the Bible. It was found in 1868 by a German missionary in the ancient city of Dibon, Jordan, the capital of the biblical kingdom of Moab. The stone itself is a substantial slab, standing about 3 feet tall, and it dates to approximately 840 years before the Common Era. Its text, written in a language very close to biblical Hebrew using an almost identical alphabet, is a first-person account by King Mesha of Moab, celebrating his successful revolt against the northern kingdom of Israel after decades of subjugation. This isn't an archaeological theory or a later historical account. This is the voice of a king who lived and fought during the time of the biblical kings, telling his side of the story. The narrative on the stele is gripping and deeply personal. It begins by establishing the context of Moab's oppression. Mesha states, Omri, king of Israel, humbled Moab many years, for Chemosh was angry with his land. This single line is a bombshell for biblical archaeology. Omri is a well-attested king in the Hebrew Bible, the father of the infamous Ahab, but outside of the Bible, there was little physical evidence for his reign or his dynasty. The Mesha stele provides that external, contemporary proof, confirming the historical existence of a powerful Israelite king named Omri from a source that is decidedly not Israeli. The stele goes on to describe how Mesha, seeing his opportunity after the reign of Omri's son, launched a war of liberation. He claims victory after victory, listing Israelite towns he captured, some of which are mentioned in the Bible, and describing how he killed all the people of the city as a spectacle for Chemosh and for Moab. The text is a raw, unfiltered account of ancient warfare, complete with boasts of slaughter, the capture of sacred vessels, and the dedication of spoils to the victor's god. The theological dimension of the stele is just as significant as the political one. For Mesha, this was not just a military victory, it was a religious triumph. The entire campaign is framed as an act of devotion to Chemosh, the chief god of the Moabites. The opening line explains that Moab's suffering was caused by Chemosh's anger, and the subsequent victories were proof that the god's favor had been restored through Mesha's actions. This worldview is a mirror image of what we see in the books of Kings and Chronicles, where Israel's fortunes rise and fall based on its fidelity to Yahweh. In one of the most poignant and chilling passages on the stele, Mesha describes recapturing the city of Nebo from Israel. He writes, "And I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, and I dragged them before Chemosh." This act of seizing the sacred objects of the Israelite god and presenting them as trophies to the Moabite deity was the ultimate symbolic act of dominance, a declaration that Chemosh was more powerful than Yahweh. This gives us a rare and vivid glimpse into the lived reality of polytheism in the region, where national gods were seen as powerful, territorial beings whose influence waxed and waned with the military success of their people. The story of the steel's discovery and decipherment reads like an archaeological thriller, marked by international rivalry, tragedy, and brilliant reconstruction. After its initial discovery, the local Bedouin who possessed it became aware of its immense value to European scholars. During negotiations, a conflict erupted, and the tribesmen, deciding that if they couldn't have a high price, no one would, heated the stone in a fire and then poured cold water over it, causing it to shatter into dozens of pieces. They then distributed the fragments among different families as bargaining chips. Thankfully, a paper squeeze or a papier-mâché impression had been made of the inscription just before its destruction. Using this squeeze and the painstaking work of scholars to reassemble the fragments, most of which were eventually recovered, the text was almost fully reconstructed. This near catastrophe underscores the fragility of our connection to the past and the sheer luck involved in preserving such a pivotal document. When scholars finally translated the complete text, they were stunned by its direct parallels with a specific story in the Hebrew Bible. The Second Book of Kings, chapter 3, tells essentially the same story from the Israelite perspective. It describes how after the death of Ahab, King Mesha of Moab rebelled against Israel. The Israelite king Jehoram allies with the kings of Judah and Edom to put down the rebellion. They march through the desert and nearly succeed, but in a desperate last stand, King Mesha sacrifices his own son and heir, the crown prince, on the city wall as a burnt offering to his god Chemosh. The biblical account then states, "And there came great wrath upon Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land." The Mesha stele does not mention this specific human sacrifice. It's not the kind of act a king would proudly immortalize for his own people, but it perfectly corroborates the geopolitical situation. A Moabite rebellion, a powerful coalition of Israel, Judah, and Edom marching to suppress it, and most importantly, a definitive Moabite victory that secured their independence. The two accounts, one Israelite and one Moabite, are like two sides of the same coin, viewing the same conflict through different cultural and theological lenses. The Bible emphasizes the horrifying act of child sacrifice that turned the tide, while the Mesha stele glorifies the subsequent military campaigns and the building projects that the new won freedom made possible. Ultimately, the power of the Mesha stele lies in this corroboration. It moves the narrative of the biblical kings out of the realm of purely religious literature and into the world of verifiable history. Here was a king mentioned in the Bible, speaking in his own words, confirming the names of places and the broader political dynamics described in the sacred text. It provides an independent witness to the existence of the House of Omri, a dynasty so significant that even the powerful Assyrian Empire in its own records would later refer to the Kingdom of Israel as the Land of Omri. The stele grounds these figures in time and place, giving them a historical weight that transcends their theological roles in the biblical narrative. More than that, it gives a voice to the other, to the neighbors and rivals of ancient Israel, who had their own kings, their own gods, and their own stories of triumph and devotion. In the defiant words of King Mesha, carved for eternity in black basalt, we hear the proud declaration of a people who fought for their freedom and believed their God had given them victory. It is a powerful reminder that history is always more complex than any single story can tell, and that the truth often lies in the dialogue between competing voices from the distant past. But what does it feel like to touch the wall of a tunnel dug by men working in desperate fear nearly 3,000 years ago? To stand in the damp, cool darkness and run your fingers over an inscription left by the very hands that performed the work. Deep beneath the ancient city of Jerusalem, carved directly into the living rock of a water tunnel, lies an answer to that question. Known as the Siloam inscription, this is not a grand royal monument erected to celebrate a king's glory. It is a simple, workmanlike memo, a brief but powerful account of a moment of triumph and relief, written in beautiful classical Hebrew script. It dates to the 8th century before the Common Era, and it commemorates one of the most daring engineering projects of the ancient world, the digging of Hezekiah's tunnel, a project born from the terrifying shadow of an approaching superpower. The historical context for this desperate undertaking is one of the most dramatic periods in the history of ancient Judah. The year is approximately 701 before the Common Era. The Assyrian Empire, the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen, is on the march. Its king, Sennacherib, has already destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and is now turning his attention to the smaller southern kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. The biblical account in the second book of Kings and the book of Isaiah describes the situation with palpable dread. Sennacherib's armies have captured all the fortified cities of Judah and now encircle Jerusalem itself. The city, under the rule of King Hezekiah, is under a state of siege. Its survival hinges on one critical resource, water. The main water source, the Gihon Spring, lay outside the city walls, making it hopelessly vulnerable. If the Assyrians controlled the spring, Jerusalem would be doomed to a swift and thirsty surrender. Hezekiah's solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. He ordered the construction of a tunnel to redirect the water from the Gihon Spring to a new, secure reservoir inside the city's defenses. This reservoir would become the Pool of Siloam. The second book of Kings, chapter 20, verse 20, describes it succinctly. Hezekiah made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city. The book of 2 Chronicles adds a more urgent motivation. Hezekiah closed the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon and directed them down to the west side of the city of David. This was a massive public works project executed under the immense pressure of an imminent military threat. It was the ancient equivalent of building a life-saving aqueduct while enemy tanks are gathering at the gates. For centuries, this story was read as a testament of faith and royal initiative, but was it history or religious legend? The existence of the tunnel itself had never been in doubt. It has been accessible for centuries. But it was the discovery of the inscription within it that transformed the biblical account from a story of faith into a documented historical event. The story of the inscription's modern discovery is a tale of chance and adventure. In 1880, a local boy was wading through the tunnel, which was still filled with flowing water, when he slipped and fell. As he regained his footing in the chest-deep water, his hands felt strange markings on the rock wall. He reported this to his teacher, who alerted authorities. Scholars soon realized the boy had stumbled upon a priceless archaeological treasure. The inscription was carefully cut from the tunnel wall to prevent vandalism and was eventually taken to Istanbul, then the capital of the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Jerusalem at the time, where it remains in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum to this day. The text itself is only 6 lines long, but its words are electric, pulling us directly into the final, climactic moments of the tunneling project. It reads, in part, "The tunneling was completed." And this was the manner of the tunneling. While the miners were still swinging their pickaxes, each toward his fellow, and while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, the voice of a man was heard calling to his fellow, for there was a fissure in the rock on the right. And on the day of the tunnel, the miners struck, each to meet his fellow, pick against pick, and the water flowed from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits. This is not the dry language of a royal chronicle. This is a foreman's report, a breathless account of a modern-sounding engineering feat. It tells us that 2 teams started digging from opposite ends, one from the spring and one from the pool, and navigated through solid rock to meet in the middle. The most astonishing detail is the mention of the fissure in the rock. This was not just a dramatic flourish, it was a crucial piece of acoustic luck. The teams, separated by a final, thick wall of stone, could hear each other's picks through a crack in the rock. This auditory connection allowed them to correct their course and finally break through to each other. The inscription captures the sheer human relief and triumph of that moment when the two teams met, pickaxe to pickaxe, and water began to flow freely to its new, secure destination. For the first time, we have the voices of the workers themselves, not the king who commissioned them, celebrating their own skill and perseverance. The engineering accomplishment this text describes is nothing short of remarkable. To appreciate it, one must consider the tools available. These were not teams with modern surveying equipment, laser guides, or dynamite. They had bronze and iron pickaxes, hammers, and chisels. They worked by lamplight in stifling, cramped conditions with the ever-present danger of collapse. The tunnel itself snakes its way for over 500 meters, or about 1,700 feet, through the bedrock of the city of David. What is truly mind-boggling is its gradient. The tunnel was dug with an incredibly subtle and consistent slope, a drop of only about 30 centimeters from start to finish, just enough to allow the water to flow gently from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam. How did they manage this? How did two teams digging from opposite directions without any of our modern technology manage to meet almost perfectly in the middle? Scholars have debated this for over a century. Some suggest they may have used a series of vertical shafts dug from the surface above to guide their path and maintain the correct elevation. Others propose they simply followed natural fissures in the limestone. Whatever their precise method, the result stands as a testament to a sophisticated, if intuitive, understanding of hydrology and geometry. The Siloam inscription is the proud signature on this masterpiece of ancient practical engineering. The historical and biblical significance of this small plaque of text is monumental. It provides the most direct, physical, and contemporary archaeological evidence possible for a specific event described in the Hebrew Bible. Here we have the tunnel, and here we have the inscription describing its construction, dating precisely to the reign of King Hezekiah and the time of the Assyrian siege. The biblical account and the archaeological evidence lock together perfectly. Furthermore, the inscription's language is a linguistic treasure. Written in a beautiful, early Hebrew script, it uses a classical Hebrew style that predates the later, more standardized script of the Dead Sea Scrolls by centuries. It is a snapshot of the living language of Jerusalem in the age of the prophets. The inscription does not mention Hezekiah by name. It was the workmen, after all, celebrating their own achievement, but its location, date, and purpose leave no doubt about the project it commemorates. It confirms the historical reality of a king who took drastic measures to save his city from a known historical threat, the army of Sennacherib. While Sennacherib's own annals boast of besieging Jerusalem and trapping Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, they conspicuously fail to mention capturing the city. Thanks to the water secured by this very tunnel, Jerusalem survived the siege, a pivotal moment that allowed the kingdom of Judah and its Davidic royal line to continue for another critical century. The humble Siloam inscription is therefore far more than a description of a mining project. It is a testament to human ingenuity under pressure, a key that unlocks a biblical story as history, and a whisper from the dark, echoing with the sound of pickaxes and the shouts of men who, against all odds, found each other in the rock and in doing so helped save a city. While grand monuments and royal inscriptions like the Siloam text tell the stories of kings and empires, some of the most profound whispers from the past come from the quiet, intimate spaces of personal faith. In 1979, as archaeologists were excavating a series of burial caves at a place called Ketef Hinnom, overlooking the Hinnom Valley just southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, they made a discovery that seemed at first glance to be utterly insignificant. Inside one of the rock-cut tombs within a burial chamber that had been in use for centuries, they found a small, rolled-up cylinder of silver. It was so delicate and crumbled with age that it was initially mistaken for a scrap of parchment. A second, similar object was found nearby. These were not imposing stone steels or lengthy papyrus scrolls. They were tiny, each no larger than a cigarette butt, and they had been worn as amulets, likely on a cord around the neck of the deceased. But when these fragile silver scrolls were carefully unrolled over a painstaking 8-year process by conservators at the Israel Museum, they revealed an inscription that would send a shockwave through the world of biblical archaeology. They contained the oldest surviving texts from the Hebrew Bible, predating the Dead Sea Scrolls by nearly half a millennium. The script on these amulets is written in a Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, a style of writing that was already ancient when they were created. Through paleographic analysis of the letter forms and the archaeological context of the tomb, scholars have dated these scrolls to the late 7th or early 6th century before the Common Era. This places them in an incredibly specific and tumultuous window of time, right on the precipice of catastrophe. This was the final decades of the Kingdom of Judah, perhaps during the reign of the reforming King Josiah, or just before the Babylonian conquest and destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. These amulets were not buried in a royal archive or a temple treasury. They were personal possessions placed in a tomb as gifts for the dead, to accompany and protect them on their journey to the afterlife. This context transforms them from simple artifacts into deeply human objects, connecting us to the private fears and hopes of an individual living in Jerusalem at the dawn of a defining national tragedy. What was written on this delicate silver foil? The text, though brief and somewhat fragmentary, is unmistakable. It preserves a version of the priestly blessing, the beautiful and resonant invocation found in the Book of Numbers, chapter 6. The longer of the two scrolls reads, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace." For anyone familiar with the Bible, reading these words from a scroll created 2,600 years ago is an almost surreal experience. This isn't a later copy from Qumran or a translation in the Septuagint. This is the blessing itself, inscribed in Jerusalem at a time when Solomon's temple was still standing, when the prophets Jeremiah and Zephaniah were walking its streets. The text on the amulets varies slightly from the canonical version we know today, showing the fluidity of textual transmission in this early period, but the core message of divine favor, grace, and peace is powerfully, eloquently present. The significance of this discovery is multifaceted and profound. First and foremost, it provides the earliest physical evidence for any text that would later be incorporated into the Hebrew Bible. Before this find, skeptical scholars could, and often did, argue that much of the Hebrew Bible was a product of a much later period, perhaps composed during or after the Babylonian exile. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls shatter that argument. They prove conclusively that this specific passage from the Torah was not only known but was in active, personal use in Jerusalem before the destruction of the First Temple and the exile to Babylon. This pushes the clock back dramatically on the composition of the biblical text, forcing us to consider that at least some parts of the Pentateuch were already fixed and regarded as sacred enough to be worn for protection centuries earlier than previously thought. Beyond the scholarly debate about dating, these amulets offer a breathtaking window into the personal piety of ordinary ancient Judeans. We often think of religion in the ancient world in terms of grand state rituals, the sacrifices in the temple, the pilgrimages for festivals, the pronouncements of kings and prophets. The Ketef Hinnom scrolls show us something much more intimate. Here was a person who sought a direct, personal connection with divine protection. They took a sacred, communal blessing spoken by priests in a public ceremony and miniaturized it, literally wearing it on their body. This act represents a powerful form of popular religion, a belief that the power of God's word was not confined to the temple walls but could be carried as a personal shield against the dangers of life and the uncertainty of death. It's a spiritual impulse we can still understand today, the desire to carry a sacred text or a protective symbol as a source of comfort and strength. The very medium of these texts, silver, is also significant. Silver was a valuable commodity in the ancient world. The fact that someone went to the expense and trouble of having these tiny scrolls meticulously inscribed by a skilled craftsman indicates their immense personal value. This was not a casual act, it was a significant investment in one's spiritual security. The practice of inscribing metal amulets with protective texts was known in the broader ancient Near East, but the Ketef Hinnom scrolls are the earliest known examples from the region that contain a direct biblical quotation. This shows that the people of Judah were participating in a wider cultural practice, but they were infusing it with their own uniquely Israelite theology, replacing generic incantations with the powerful, covenantal words of their own God. The amulets represent a fascinating fusion of form and content, where a common magical practice is transformed into a profound expression of faith in Yahweh. Ultimately, the power of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls lies in their ability to collapse the distance between us and an individual who lived through one of the most pivotal moments in Judean history. We do not know their name, their gender, or their station in life, though the richness of the tombs suggests they were from a wealthy family, but we know what they cherished enough to take to the grave. In a world facing the rising power of Babylon, with political instability and prophetic warnings of doom filling the air, this person sought solace and safety in the ancient words of a blessing. They believed that the face of God could shine upon them, could be gracious to them, and could grant them peace. These two tiny, crumpled sheets of silver are a testament to a faith that was both personal and portable, a faith that could survive the collapse of kingdoms and the destruction of temples. They remind us that the most enduring texts are not always the longest or the most official, but sometimes the smallest ones, written not for an empire but for a single, hopeful heart. Now let's sail up the Nile, far south from Jerusalem, to a strategic island fortress at the first cataract of the river, right on the border of ancient Egypt and Nubia. This is Elephantine Island, named for the ivory trade that once passed through it, and here, in the 5th century before the Common Era, lived a community that would have seemed almost impossible if not for the paper trail they left behind. We are talking about a military garrison of Judean soldiers and their families, serving as mercenaries for the Persian Empire, living a full and complex Jewish life hundreds of miles from the ruins of Solomon's Temple. Their story was entirely lost to history until the late 19th century, when local Egyptian farmers digging for fertilizer in the ancient mounds on the island began to uncover bundles of papyrus. These were the Elephantine Papyri, a treasure trove of over 100 documents written in Aramaic, the administrative language of the Persian Empire. These weren't religious scrolls hidden in a cave. They were the everyday paperwork of a real, functioning community: letters, marriage contracts, divorce deeds, wills, and property transfers. They are the archives of a diaspora, a direct line into the lives of ordinary people trying to preserve their identity in a foreign land. Imagine the scene. This was a multicultural hub, a frontier town where Egyptians, Persians, Babylonians, Greeks, and these Judean mercenaries all lived side by side. The papyri introduce us to people with names like Mibtahiah, a shrewd Judean woman who appears in numerous legal documents, buying and selling property and navigating the legal system with remarkable confidence. We meet Ananiah, a priest of the Judean temple, and his wife Tammut, an Egyptian slave who was freed upon their marriage. Through their petty disputes over property lines, their carefully negotiated marriage contracts, and their heartfelt personal letters, these people cease to be abstract historical figures and become vivid, relatable characters. We learn about the price of a house, the cost of a divorce, and the social tensions that could arise in such a mixed community. One letter even details a violent riot where the Egyptian priests of the local god Khnum, incensed by the animal sacrifices happening at the Jewish temple, instigated a mob that destroyed it. This isn't just a footnote, it's a front-page news story from the 5th century BCE, showing us the very real friction that could exist between different religious groups in a cosmopolitan setting. Perhaps the single most astonishing revelation from these papyri is the existence of that very temple. The community at Elephantine didn't just have a synagogue or a prayer house. They had a fully functioning temple dedicated to Yahweh, the God of Israel, complete with an altar for animal sacrifices. This is a historical fact that contradicts the centralizing religious reform described in the book of Deuteronomy, which commanded that sacrifice could only be offered at one place, the temple in Jerusalem. For centuries, scholars believed this was strictly observed. Yet here, at the same time that Ezra and Nehemiah were supposedly reforming Judaism in Jerusalem and enforcing strict monotheism, a vibrant Jewish community in Egypt was running its own temple, making its own offerings, and worshipping in its own way. Even more startling, the papyri show that their worship was not purely monotheistic in the way we might expect. Alongside Yahweh, their official letters and oaths sometimes mention other divine beings, referred to as Eshem Bethel and Anat Bethel. It appears that in this diaspora setting, the community's understanding of Yahweh had been influenced by the surrounding Aramaic and Egyptian cultures, absorbing elements of the local divine hierarchy. This isn't necessarily a sign of apostasy, but rather of a living, evolving faith, one that saw Yahweh as the supreme God, but perhaps not the only spiritual power in the universe. The most dramatic set of documents in the collection revolves around the crisis of the temple's destruction. After it was torn down by the rioters, the leaders of the Elephantine community did what any good bureaucrats would do: they wrote letters. They sent appeals for help and funds to rebuild, not just to Jerusalem, but also to the governors of Samaria and even to the son of the Samaritan governor. The surviving drafts of these letters are priceless. They are filled with political maneuvering and desperate pleading. They carefully frame their request to appeal to the Persian authorities, emphasizing their loyalty to the empire and downplaying any potential theological objections from Jerusalem. They even try to shift the blame, suggesting the destruction happened because the Persian authorities weren't there to prevent it. The response they received is equally fascinating. The authorities in Jerusalem and Samaria eventually wrote back, giving them permission to rebuild the temple, but with a crucial and telling restriction. They could rebuild the altar and resume grain and incense offerings, but they were expressly forbidden from resuming animal sacrifices. This compromise reveals the shifting theological landscape. The Jerusalem priesthood was flexing its authority, asserting its unique role as the only legitimate place for blood sacrifice, while still allowing their distant cousins to maintain their community and their form of worship, just in a slightly diminished capacity. The Elephantine papyri, therefore, are far more than a collection of ancient legal forms. They are a powerful corrective to any simple, linear narrative of Jewish history. They show us that Judaism in the Persian period was not a single, monolithic entity being neatly reformed in Jerusalem. It was a tapestry of diverse practices, with multiple centers of worship and varying degrees of adherence to what would later become Orthodox belief. The community at Elephantine represents a branch of Judaism that developed independently, adapting to its environment while fiercely holding onto its core identity. They celebrated the Passover, as we know from one specific letter that instructs the community on how to properly observe the festival. They kept the Sabbath. They gave their children Hebrew names. They saw themselves as Jews. Their story is the story of resilience and adaptation, of a people determined to worship their God and live by their laws, even when it meant building a temple for Yahweh on an island in the Nile, 1,000 miles from home. These fragile sheets of papyrus give us the chance to walk the dusty streets of their frontier town, to listen in on their legal disputes, and to understand that the path of faith is never just one road, but many, all leading back to the same deeply human need for community, identity, and a connection to the divine. But imagine staring at the remnants of a civilization for centuries, surrounded by their magnificent temples, their towering obelisks, and the silent, painted eyes of their gods, yet being utterly incapable of reading a single word they wrote. This was the frustrating reality for scholars of Egypt before the turn of the 19th century. The ancient Egyptian language, once vibrant and spoken for thousands of years, had fallen silent. Its final form, the flowing script known as Demotic, ceased to be used in the 5th century of the Common Era, and the majestic pictorial writing of the hieroglyphs had been a mystery for even longer. The knowledge of how to read them vanished, and for over a millennium, the countless inscriptions covering every monument from the pyramids to the Valley of the Kings were just elegant, meaningless decorations. They were a locked door, and the key had been thrown away. That is, until a group of French soldiers involved in Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt, while repairing a fort near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta in 1799, unearthed a dark granodiorite slab that would change everything. This was the Rosetta Stone. The stone itself is a fragment of a much larger stele, originally erected in the year 196 before the Common Era during the reign of the young pharaoh Ptolemy V. What made this particular slab of rock so extraordinary was not its age, impressive as that was, but what was carved upon it. The same decree from the Egyptian priesthood, affirming the royal cult of the 13-year-old king, was inscribed in 3 separate scripts. At the top were the formal, sacred hieroglyphs, the writing of the gods and of monumental inscriptions. In the middle was Demotic, the cursive script used for everyday administrative and literary purposes by the Egyptian people. And at the bottom was Ancient Greek, the language of the ruling Ptolemaic dynasty and their government, a language that was still very well understood by European scholars in the 19th century. The immediate, electrifying realization was that these 3 blocks of text must say the same thing. For the first time, scholars had a translation manual. They had a known language, Greek, that could be used as a cipher to crack the code of the 2 unknown Egyptian scripts. It was like finding a secret decoder ring buried in the sand. The race to decipher the stone was an international intellectual battle, a clash of brilliant minds, national pride, and very different methodological approaches. The British Army captured the stone from the French in 1801 as a prize of war, and it was sent to the British Museum in London, where it has resided ever since. This meant that while the physical object was in England, copies of the inscriptions, known as squeezes, were circulated throughout Europe, allowing scholars everywhere to attempt the decipherment. The initial progress was slow and fraught with wrong turns. Many scholars, still influenced by classical authors who believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic, mystical ideograms, spent years trying to find profound philosophical concepts in each little picture. They thought a hawk represented speed, a crocodile meant evil, and a circle symbolized eternity. This approach led them nowhere. The real breakthrough came from a foundational insight that the Egyptian scripts, particularly Demotic and by extension hieroglyphs, were not just picture writing, but must contain phonetic elements, signs that represented sounds, just like the letters in an alphabet. The 2 men who ultimately triumphed, working both in competition and in parallel, were the English polymath Thomas Young and the French linguistic prodigy Jean-François Champollion. Young, a brilliant physicist and physician, took a scientific, statistical approach. He started with the Greek text, which contained the names of rulers like Ptolemy. He then looked for a group of hieroglyphic signs enclosed in a distinctive oval loop called a cartouche, correctly assuming that these would encircle royal names. By comparing the number of hieroglyphs in the Ptolemy cartouche to the number of letters in the Greek name, and by finding the same cartouche on other monuments, he began to assign sound values to a handful of hieroglyphic signs. He proved they could represent sounds, but it was Champollion, a man utterly consumed by ancient languages since his youth, who made the final, breathtaking leap. He gained access to copies of inscriptions from other temples, including one from Abu Simbel that contained a cartouche with another name. Using the phonetic values he and Young had begun to establish, he read the signs. They spelled out Kleopatra. This was the moment of confirmation. He then applied his system to a third cartouche, one that began with a circular sign. He deciphered it as RAMSS for the great pharaoh Ramesses, and then another as THUTMS for Thutmose. In a triumphant cry to his brother, he is reported to have shouted, "G Tynes Ella Fair, I've got it." He hadn't just decoded names, he had discovered that the hieroglyphic system was a complex, sophisticated mix of phonetic signs for consonants, logograms that represented whole words, and determinatives, which were silent signs placed at the end of a word to clarify its meaning. The impact of this decipherment was nothing less than a revolution. It was as if a vast, silent library had suddenly been given a voice. The walls of every tomb and temple, which had been mute for 1500 years, began to speak. Scholars could now read the religious spells from the pyramid texts and the Book of the Dead, understanding the ancient Egyptians' profound beliefs about the afterlife. They could translate the boasts of pharaohs on their victory stelae, the administrative records on papyri, the poetry, the medical texts, the love songs, and the mundane letters. The entire history of Egypt shifted from a collection of mysterious ruins and garbled accounts from Greek historians into a detailed, written narrative told by the Egyptians themselves. We learn the true names of the kings who built the great monuments, the details of their military campaigns, the intricacies of their economy, and the depth of their theological and philosophical thought. The Rosetta Stone did not just unlock a language, it resurrected a civilization. It gave us back 30 centuries of human history that had been lost in silence, allowing us to finally listen to the stories the ancient Egyptians had so carefully carved in stone for eternity. From the cosmopolitan world of the Elephantine mercenaries and the linguistic triumph of the Rosetta Stone, we journey now to a different kind of battlefield, one of the mind, where strategy and philosophy are more powerful weapons than any sword. In the spring of 1972, archaeologists excavating two Western Han Dynasty tombs at a site called Yingqueshan, or Silver Sparrow Mountain, in Shandong Province, China, made an extraordinary discovery. The tombs, sealed around 140 to 118 years before the Common Era, were waterlogged, creating an oxygen-poor environment that preserved organic materials that would have normally turned to dust. And there, amid the funerary goods, they found a treasure that would rewrite the history of one of the world's most influential books, a complete edition of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, written not on paper or silk, but on thousands of delicate bamboo slips, tied together with cords into bundles that had lain undisturbed for over 2,000 years. Before this discovery, our knowledge of Sun Tzu's text came from later, heavily edited and transmitted copies. Scholars debated its true age, its authorship, and even its completeness. The Yingqueshan manuscript settled many of these debates at a stroke. Here was a version of the text that predated all other known copies by centuries, preserved in the very medium in which it was first composed. Imagine the patient work of the scribe, carefully inscribing each vertical column of classical Chinese characters onto individual bamboo slats with a brush and ink. These slips were then bound together in sequence with silk or hemp cord to form a scroll, a physical object that demanded reverence and care. The tombs also contained a related text, The Art of War, attributed to Sun Bin, a later strategist who was thought by some to be the same person as Sun Tzu. The discovery of both texts in the same tomb proved conclusively that they were two distinct works and two distinct historical figures, finally clarifying a centuries-old historical mystery. But the real revolution of the Yingqueshan find was not just the confirmation of the core 13 chapters we know today. It was the revelation of what had been lost. The bamboo slips contained the familiar text, but they also included a wealth of additional material, 5 extra chapters, that had been completely excised from the standard version that has been passed down for 2 millennia. These lost chapters, with names like The Yellow Emperor Attacks the Red Emperor and Offensive Strategy, open a new window into the military thought of the era. They expand upon the philosophical foundations of the core text, blending the practical advice on warfare with deeper cosmological and political theories. They discuss the use of terrain in even greater tactical detail and delve into the psychological management of not just the enemy, but one's own troops and civilian population. These additional texts show that the original Art of War was an even richer and more comprehensive manual of statecraft than we had ever imagined. So, what is it about this ancient text that has given it such incredible staying power, making it a bestseller in boardrooms and military academies alike 2,500 years after it was written? The answer lies in its fundamental philosophy. Sun Tzu's work is not really a book about fighting, it is a book about winning without having to fight. Its supreme ideal is the complete and bloodless victory. The most famous passage encapsulates this perfectly. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. This is not a pacifist text, it is ruthlessly pragmatic. It recognizes that war is a massive drain on the state's resources, a calamity for the population, and an inherently uncertain endeavor. Therefore, the ultimate strategy is to break the enemy's resistance through deception, espionage, political isolation, and psychological manipulation long before armies ever meet on the field. The actual battle, when it occurs, is merely the final, public confirmation of a victory that has already been secured in the shadows. The text operates on a principle of strategic intelligence that feels astonishingly modern. Sun Tzu places immense emphasis on self-knowledge and knowledge of the enemy. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles, he writes. But this knowledge is not just about counting soldiers or assessing weapons. It is about understanding the morale of the troops, the skill of the commanders, the economic strength of the state, and the political will of its leaders. He advocates for a vast and sophisticated intelligence network, stating that the reason a wise general can achieve results beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge. This foreknowledge cannot be elicited from spirits, nor from gods, nor by analogy with past events, nor from calculations. It must be obtained from men who know the enemy situation. This is the birth of systematic espionage as a tool of state policy. Perhaps the most resonant concept for modern readers is the idea of shi, a word often translated as strategic advantage or disposition of power. Shi is not merely a positional advantage like holding the high ground. It is the art of arranging your forces and shaping the circumstances to create an overwhelming momentum, like a torrent of water pushing boulders downstream. It is the energy stored in a drawn crossbow, the force of a rolling log crashing down a mountain. A master commander does not rely on the brute force of his individual soldiers, but on the irresistible shi of his overall formation and strategy. He creates a situation where victory is the natural and almost effortless outcome of the setup. This is why Sun Tzu advises a commander to be like water, which has no constant form, and to avoid strength while striking at weakness. Water flows around obstacles, finds the lowest ground, and over time can wear away the hardest stone. This fluid, adaptive approach to conflict is what makes the text feel so timeless, applicable not only to war but to business negotiations, legal disputes, and personal challenges. The enduring influence of The Art of War is a testament to its profound insights into human nature and competitive systems. In Asia, it was a foundational text for centuries of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean generals and statesmen. In the modern West, it was discovered by military theorists and business leaders who saw in its principles a universal logic of competition. Corporate strategists use its teachings on deception. All warfare is based on deception, to plan corporate takeovers and market launches. They apply its emphasis on speed and adaptability. Be extremely subtle even to the point of formlessness. Be extremely mysterious even to the point of soundlessness. Thereby you can be the director of the opponent's fate, to navigate fast-changing industries. Sports coaches use its lessons on morale and terrain to prepare for big games. The bamboo slips from Yingqueshan, therefore, are not just the oldest copy of a famous book. They are the physical origin point for a way of thinking about power, conflict, and success that has transcended its original context to become a permanent part of the global intellectual toolkit, a whisper from an ancient Chinese strategist that still guides the maneuvers of the modern world. But hidden within the caves of Qumran, among the leather and papyrus scrolls filled with sacred scripture and community rules, was an object so strange, so radically different, that it stands apart from all the others. In Cave 3, archaeologists didn't find another fragile scroll. They found two oxidized, brittle rolls of metal. This was the copper scroll. Unlike every other Dead Sea Scroll, this one was not written on a perishable surface. Its text was painstakingly hammered into thin sheets of copper, a material meant to endure, and the message it carried was not a prayer, a prophecy, or a psalm. It was a list, a detailed, matter-of-fact inventory of 64 locations where staggering quantities of treasure were supposedly hidden. We are talking about tons of gold and silver, along with precious perfumes, ritual objects, and even other scrolls. The quantities are listed with bureaucratic precision, describing vast sums like 17 talents of gold and 65 bars of silver. To put that in perspective, a single talent was roughly 75 pounds, so the scroll describes a hoard of precious metal that would be worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars in today's terms. This was not a spiritual guide to the afterlife. It was a treasure map, and it has been the source of endless fascination and fierce debate ever since its discovery. The uniqueness of the Copper Scroll begins with its language. While most of the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in a beautiful, literary Hebrew, the language of the Copper Scroll is different. It's a form of Hebrew that closely resembles the spoken language of the Mishnah, but with a mix of Greek words for the measurements of weight and a handful of unknown terms that still puzzle scholars. It feels less like a sacred text and more like a practical memorandum, a set of instructions written down in a hurry by someone who needed to ensure the information would survive. The fact that it was written on copper is the most significant clue. In the ancient world, important public documents were sometimes inscribed on bronze for permanence. Think of the Code of Hammurabi. By choosing copper, the author was sending a clear signal. This information was not meant for daily use or study. It was meant to last, to be recovered at a much later date, surviving the ravages of time, moisture, and decay that would destroy any parchment or papyrus record. This was a message for the future. So, what exactly does this ancient treasure map describe? The entries follow a repetitive, cryptic formula. They name a location, then describe the treasure hidden there, and sometimes give a small additional clue. For instance, one entry reads, "In the salt pit that is under the steps, 41 talents of silver." Another says, "In the cavity of the old house of tithing, in the platform of the chain circle, 65 gold bars." The locations are almost all in and around Jerusalem, with specific references to the Kidron Valley, various pools like the Pool of Solomon, and several tombs. Most tantalizingly, many of the hiding places seem to be connected to the temple complex itself, under stairs, in cisterns, in water channels, and in courtyards. This has led to the most compelling theory, that the Copper Scroll is a record of the hidden treasures of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, squirreled away in the final, desperate days before the Roman legions destroyed the city and the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded that the temple held immense wealth, and it stands to reason that priests or rebels would have tried to save these sacred objects and funds from the Roman army, hiding them with the hope of returning to reclaim them after the war was over. Of course, a mystery of this scale could not exist without a host of competing theories. One of the most persistent alternative ideas is that the treasure described is not literal at all, but symbolic. Could this be a work of fiction, a piece of folklore about legendary treasures from the time of the First Temple? Or perhaps it's a coded text referring to spiritual riches, a map not to gold but to esoteric knowledge hidden by the Essene community. The problem with this theory is the scroll's stark, unadorned tone. It lacks any of the poetic or theological language found in every other sectarian text from Qumran. It reads like a dry inventory list, not an allegory. Another controversial theory suggests the treasure was never hidden by Jewish priests, but was actually the vast wealth of the Essene community itself, accumulated over generations and buried for safekeeping. Yet, the amounts described are so astronomically large, far beyond the means of a small, ascetic desert community, that this seems highly unlikely. The sheer scale of the treasure points directly to an institution of immense wealth, and in 1st century Judea, that institution was the temple in Jerusalem. The great, frustrating irony of the Copper Scroll is that while its instructions seem precise, the landmarks it names are almost impossible to identify today. The topography of Jerusalem has been radically altered over 2,000 years through multiple destructions, rebuildings, and centuries of urban development. The old house of tithing, the platform of the chain circle, the cave of the pillar, these places are lost to history. This has not stopped countless treasure hunters, amateur archaeologists, and even serious scholars from trying to decode its directions. Over the decades, there have been numerous expeditions, both clandestine and official, to dig at sites in the Kidron Valley and around the old city of Jerusalem. To date, not a single bar of gold or silver from the Copper Scroll has ever been found. This complete lack of physical evidence is what keeps the mystery alive. Perhaps the treasure was discovered and looted in antiquity, not long after it was hidden. Perhaps the Romans, who were notorious for torturing prisoners to find hidden wealth, extracted the information and recovered it themselves. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it still lies buried, waiting for someone to finally match the ancient words on the copper with the right patch of earth, securing a fortune that has been lost for 2 millennia. Ultimately, the Copper Scroll forces us to confront the messy, material reality behind the spiritual fervor of the 1st century. While the other Dead Sea Scrolls illuminate the inner world of a community preparing for an apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, the Copper Scroll is a document of pure, pragmatic contingency. It speaks to a moment of profound crisis when the most sacred objects of a nation were in imminent danger of being looted, melted down, or carried off as trophies for a Roman triumph. The decision to etch this list onto copper was an act of desperate hope, a belief that even if the people perished and the temple was razed, the record of their sacred treasure would survive, a metallic seed waiting for a future restoration that never came. It is a tangible link to one of the most traumatic events in Jewish history, a whispered secret from the brink of catastrophe. The Copper Scroll may not lead us to gold, but it leads us directly to the human heart of a tragedy, reminding us that faith, in times of utter devastation, can manifest not only in prayers for salvation, but in the gritty, determined act of burying a treasure and believing that someday someone will come back for it. But to truly grasp the radical nature of the Gospel of Thomas, we need to place it side by side with the New Testament Gospels we know. The difference is not just in content, but in fundamental purpose. The Gospel of Mark, for example, is a story. It's a narrative driven by action. Jesus is baptized, he casts out demons, he heals the sick, he confronts the authorities, he is crucified, and he rises from the dead. The entire drama leads to the climactic revelation of the empty tomb. In Mark, the identity of Jesus is the central mystery. Who do you say that I am? The answer is revealed through what he does, but open the Gospel of Thomas and there is no story. There is no nativity, no miracles on the Sea of Galilee, no trial before Pontius Pilate, and no resurrection appearance. The Jesus of Thomas does not do anything, he simply speaks. The entire text is a collection of his sayings, and the central mystery is not who is he, but what does he mean. the focus shifts dramatically from the person of Jesus as a savior who acts in history to the teachings of Jesus as a timeless key to unlock a hidden reality within the listener. This core message of inner awakening is encapsulated in one of the Gospel's most famous and debated sayings, saying 77. Jesus says, "Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift up the stone and you will find me there." This is a universe away from the Jesus who promises to be present, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, in the Gospel of Matthew. In Thomas, the divine presence is not confined to a community of believers or a church. It is immanent, woven into the very fabric of the material world. It suggests that the kingdom of God is not a future destination to be reached after death or a final judgment, but a state of perception that can be realized here and now by seeing the world rightly. This connects directly to saying 113, where his disciples ask him when the kingdom will come. Jesus replies, "It will not come by watching for it. It will not be said, 'Look, here it is,' or 'Look, there it is.' Rather, the Father's kingdom is spread out upon the earth and people do not see it. The problem, according to Thomas, is not that we need to be saved from our sins by a sacrificial death, but that we are asleep, ignorant of our own true, divine nature and the divine reality that permeates everything around us. Salvation, or gnosis, is the moment of waking up. The process of achieving this awakening is laid out as a path of intense self-discovery, and it is often described in language that feels deliberately paradoxical, designed to shatter conventional logic. Consider saying 2, which we mentioned earlier, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all." This is a map of the spiritual journey, and it's not a comfortable one. The initial seeking is familiar, but the stage of being troubled is crucial. This is the moment when old certainties collapse, when your previous understanding of God, the world, and yourself is thrown into chaos. It's the dark night of the soul that precedes the dawn of true astonishment. Only by passing through this disorienting confusion can one arrive at a state of ruling over the all, which is not about worldly power, but about a state of spiritual sovereignty and unity with the divine source. This is a far more individualistic and psychologically intense path to salvation than the one offered by the emerging Orthodox Church, which emphasized faith in the historical events of Jesus' life and participation in the sacraments administered by a clerical hierarchy. For modern readers and scholars, the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas has had 2 profound and interrelated impacts. First, it has ignited a fierce and fascinating debate about the historical Jesus. Some scholars, like those associated with the Jesus Seminar, have argued that the sayings in Thomas, or at least a core layer of them, are very old, perhaps as old as or even older than the sayings found in the canonical Gospels. They suggest that Thomas might preserve an early, independent stream of the Jesus tradition, one that focused on wisdom teachings rather than apocalyptic prophecy or a messianic secret. In this view, the historical Jesus was primarily a wisdom teacher, a Jewish sage, and the later narrative frameworks of his life, death, and resurrection were theological interpretations added by his followers. Other scholars strongly dispute this, pointing to the clearly Gnostic themes in many of the sayings, and arguing that the Gospel as a whole is a 2nd century composition that reflects later theological developments. This debate forces us to confront the fact that the earliest Christians were not a monolithic group with a single, agreed-upon story about Jesus. They were diverse communities, each remembering, interpreting, and adapting his teachings in ways that spoke to their own specific circumstances and spiritual needs. This leads directly to the second major implication of the Gospel of Thomas. It fundamentally reshapes our understanding of how the New Testament canon came to be. For centuries, the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were seen as the natural, self-evident accounts of Jesus' life. The discovery of texts like Thomas reveals that this was not the case at all. The process was one of intense conflict, debate, and eventual decision-making by a powerful, emerging Orthodox institution. The Church Fathers, men like Irenaeus of Lyons in the 2nd century, argued passionately that there could only be 4 Gospels, just as there are 4 corners of the earth or 4 cardinal winds. They dismissed texts like the Gospel of Thomas as fabricated and impious works full of blasphemous fables. The victory of the 4 canonical Gospels was a victory for a specific kind of Christianity, one that emphasized a flesh and blood Jesus who truly suffered, died, and was physically resurrected, against the Gnostic view that saw the material world and the physical body as a prison from which to escape. The Nag Hammadi Library, and the Gospel of Thomas at its heart, is the surviving voice of the losing side in that great theological civil war. It preserves for us a road not taken, a version of Christianity that was more mystical, more introspective, and in many ways more demanding, placing the entire responsibility for salvation on the individual's quest for the divine light within. And yet, for all the triumph of deciphering Linear B and hearing the voices of the Mycenaean Greeks, there remains an older, more stubborn silence. On the same island of Crete, in the very same palace of Knossos where Arthur Evans first uncovered the mysteries of the Bronze Age, lies an even deeper puzzle. Before the Mycenaean Greeks ever arrived with their Linear B script, the brilliant and sophisticated Minoan civilization had already developed a system of writing all their own. This is Linear A, a script etched onto clay tablets, stone libation tables, and ceremonial objects across Crete and the Aegean Islands from around 1800 to 1450 before the Common Era. It is a ghost in the clay, a beautiful and complex code that has, for over a century, defied every attempt to crack it. While we can walk through the sprawling, labyrinthine palaces of the Minoans and marvel at their vibrant, life-filled frescoes of leaping dolphins and elegant courtiers, we cannot read a single word they wrote. Their language remains locked away, the greatest unsolved mystery of the ancient Aegean world. The challenge of deciphering Linear is a perfect storm of linguistic and historical obstacles. The primary reason it remains a mystery is the same reason its cousin, Linear B, was so difficult. We have no Rosetta Stone. There is no bilingual text, no parallel inscription in a known language that can serve as a key. But the problem with Linear is even more profound. With Linear B, Michael Ventris had a brilliant, if radical, working hypothesis that the language might be an early form of Greek. For Linear A, we have no such solid clue as to what the underlying language might be. Scholars have proposed dozens of candidates, from a unique pre-Greek Minoan language to something related to Luwian from Anatolia, or even a very early form of Etruscan. Without a clear linguistic family to place it in, every attempt at decipherment is essentially a shot in the dark, a guess that must then be tested against the entire corpus of inscriptions, a process that has so far led to no consensus whatsoever. Furthermore, the physical evidence we have is limited and frustratingly one-sided. The vast majority of Linear A inscriptions that survive are on clay tablets that are, like the Linear B records, short-term administrative documents. They are lists and inventories filled with logograms for commodities like grain, wine, figs, and olives, followed by numerals and what are presumably personal or place names. While this gives us a glimpse into the Minoan economy, it provides a very narrow vocabulary. We see the words for total and so much, and the names of commodities, but we lack the rich variety of verbs, adjectives, and grammatical structures found in narrative texts, poetry, or royal inscriptions. It is as if future archaeologists were trying to decipher the English language using only grocery lists and warehouse receipts. We can sometimes guess what the text is about, but we cannot understand its grammatical soul or its deeper meaning. Despite these immense challenges, scholars have not been completely blind. By carefully comparing Linear A to the later, deciphered Linear B, they have been able to make some fascinating headway. The two scripts share a significant number of identical or very similar signs. It is clear that when the Mycenaeans arrived on Crete, they did not invent their own writing system from scratch. They adapted the existing linear script which they found in use by the Minoans to write their own, completely different Greek language. They took many of the phonetic signs and gave them values that worked for the sounds of Greek. This means we can often look at a linear sign and know its approximate phonetic value based on its linear B counterpart. We can read the signs aloud, but the words they form are in an unknown language. It is like being able to sound out words in Finnish or Hungarian without knowing a word of either language. You can pronounce it, but you have no idea what it means. This has allowed researchers to identify potential place names like Pa-Ita for Phaistos and the names of deities, but the core vocabulary and grammar remain elusive. What these silent tablets do tell us, however, speaks volumes about the nature of Minoan society. The administrative records reveal a highly centralized and sophisticated economy, centered on the great palaces like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia. The meticulous accounting of agricultural produce, livestock, and manufactured goods points to a complex redistributive system, not unlike the one we later see with the Mycenaeans. The palace acted as the central hub, collecting surplus from the surrounding countryside and then redistributing it to specialists, officials, and perhaps the population at large, especially during festivals or times of shortage. We see evidence of a society deeply engaged in trade across the Mediterranean, with records of wool, olive oil, and prized saffron, a luxury product that was a major Minoan export. The very existence of this bureaucracy, managed through a unified writing system across the island, suggests a level of political and economic integration that was unprecedented in Europe at the time. Perhaps the most tantalizing clues about Minoan beliefs come not from the administrative tablets, but from the inscriptions found on religious objects. Libation tables and offerings from peak sanctuaries and sacred caves are often inscribed with linear A. These texts are thought to be dedicatory formulas, prayers, or the names of deities offered by worshippers. By comparing the structure of these inscriptions to similar dedicatory formulas from the ancient Near East, some researchers have tentatively identified recurring word patterns that might mean gift or offering, and have proposed names for Minoan gods and goddesses. One particularly common sign group, a Romi, appears in clearly religious contexts and is thought by many to be the name of a major Minoan divinity, perhaps a precursor to later Greek goddesses like Demeter or Aphrodite. These fragments are like overhearing a few scattered words from a sacred ritual. We can sense the importance and the context, but the full prayer, the full meaning of the ceremony, remains just out of reach. The ultimate fate of linear is tied to the dramatic collapse of Minoan civilization itself. Around 1450 before the Common Era, most of the major Minoan centers, with the notable exception of Knossos, were destroyed, likely by a combination of natural disasters, such as the colossal volcanic eruption on Thera, and the increasing military and economic pressure from the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans then took control of Knossos, and it was at this point that the administrative script switched from the Minoan language of Linear A to the Greek language of Linear B. The old Minoan language, whatever it was, ceased to be used for official record-keeping. It may have survived for a time as a spoken language among the local population, but without the patronage of the palace system, its written form faded into obscurity, remembered only on old tablets that were soon buried by rubble and time. The silence of Linear is therefore the silence of a conquered culture, a vibrant and unique world whose voice was subdued and ultimately lost. The ongoing quest to decipher Linear is more than an academic exercise. It is an attempt to recover a lost world in its own words. Every new archaeological find, every fresh statistical analysis of the sign patterns offers a glimmer of hope. Modern technologies like high-resolution digital imaging and sophisticated computer algorithms are being employed to look for patterns invisible to the human eye. The dream is that one day a single crucial discovery will be made, perhaps a substantial bilingual inscription or a longer text that provides the necessary context that will finally break the code. Until that day, the linear tablets stand as a humbling reminder of the limits of our knowledge. They are the stark, beautiful evidence of a great civilization that we can see so vividly through its art and architecture, but whose thoughts, stories, and prayers we can only guess at, a whole universe of human experience waiting patiently in the clay to be understood. Yet, even as the great empires of the Bronze Age were perfecting their cuneiform and hieroglyphs, a very different kind of mark was being made far to the east in the fertile plains of ancient China. Our journey now takes us to a Neolithic site known as Jiahu, located in Henan province, where a discovery was made that pushes the very boundary of what we call writing. Here, in graves dating back to an astonishing 6,600 to 6,200 years before the Common Era, archaeologists unearthed a collection of tortoise shells and animal bones. These were not ordinary remains. Carefully placed in burial pits, many of these shells and bones bore strange, deliberate markings, incised symbols that look hauntingly familiar to anyone who has seen the later Chinese oracle bone script. But these markings from Jiahu are millennia older than the accepted dawn of Chinese writing. They are ghostly precursors, a whisper of a system of recording that may represent one of humanity's very first, halting steps toward the written word. The context of these finds is crucial to understanding their potential significance. The Jiahu site reveals a sophisticated Neolithic culture, one that was cultivating rice, brewing fermented beverages from honey, fruit, and rice, and crafting beautiful flutes from the wing bones of cranes, some of the oldest playable musical instruments ever found. This was not a primitive society, but one with complex rituals, art, and technology. The marked tortoise shells were found in burial contexts, often in groups, and some were even filled with small, colored stones, suggesting they may have been used as rattles in shamanic rituals or as grave goods for the elite. This ritual association is profound. It links the very act of making these marks to a sacred, ceremonial world, suggesting that the symbols were not merely mundane tallies, but possessed a power and meaning that transcended everyday life. The fact that the marks were made on tortoise shells is itself a powerful precedent, as the tortoise shell would become the primary medium for the definitive oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty over 4,000 years later. This continuity of medium across such a vast span of time is a stunning clue, hinting at a deep cultural thread connecting these Neolithic symbols to the first undisputed Chinese script. So, what do these enigmatic symbols actually look like? To the untrained eye, they might appear as simple scratches, but to epigraphers, scholars who study ancient inscriptions, their form is tantalizing. There are a limited number of distinct signs, and they recur on different artifacts. Some resemble the sun or an eye, others look like a doorway or a tally mark. A few bear a striking and almost uncanny resemblance to characters found in the later Shang dynasty oracle bone script. One symbol, for instance, looks remarkably similar to the ancient character for eye, while another has been compared to the character for sun. This visual similarity is the heart of the debate. Are we seeing a direct linear ancestor to Chinese writing? Or are we simply seeing similar, simple shapes that different cultures could independently invent to represent basic concepts? This brings us to the central and still unresolved scholarly controversy. Are the Jiahu symbols a true proto-writing, or are they something else? The distinction is critical. Proto-writing is a term for systems that convey information but lack the full capacity of a true writing system to record language. Think of it as the difference between a single road sign that means danger and a full sentence that says, there is a sharp curve ahead followed by a narrow bridge. The Jiahu symbols could be a form of proto-writing, perhaps a system of clan markings, ownership signs, or ritual symbols used by shamans to denote specific deities, ancestral spirits, or concepts during ceremonies. They may have been a mnemonic device reminding the user of a specific prayer or incantation without actually spelling out the words. In this view, the symbols are meaningful, but they are not yet components of a system capable of expressing the full, fluid complexity of spoken language. The opposing viewpoint, held by some bold scholars, is that the Jiahu symbols represent the earliest known stage of the Chinese writing system. They argue that the recurrence of specific forms, their presence on ritual objects, and their visual kinship with later characters is too compelling to ignore. Proponents of this theory suggest that we are looking at a very early logographic script where a single symbol represented an entire word or idea. If this is true, it would mean the Chinese script has a history nearly twice as long as previously believed, stretching back into the very depths of the Neolithic period. It would rewrite the history of literacy, placing its origins not in the complex state-level bureaucracy of the Bronze Age Shang dynasty, but in the ritual life of a much earlier village-based society. Ultimately, the evidence remains inconclusive. The primary obstacle is the sheer scarcity of the material. We have only a handful of these marked shells and bones from Jiahu. Without a larger corpus of texts, it is statistically impossible to perform the kind of analysis that proved Linear B was Greek. We cannot identify grammatical patterns, sentence structure, or a sufficient vocabulary to confirm we are looking at a written language. The debate, therefore, rests on interpretation. Skeptics rightly caution against connecting dots across a 4,000-year gap based on a few similar shapes. They point out that simple, geometric marks occur independently in many prehistoric cultures worldwide and are often just ownership marks or decorative motifs with no linguistic value. The burden of proof, they argue, lies with those who claim it is writing. Yet, the proponents counter that the ritual context, the choice of medium, and the specific visual parallels create a cumulative case that is too strong to dismiss as mere coincidence. The significance of the Jiahu symbols, regardless of the final verdict on their linguistic nature, is immense. They force us to reconsider the very process of how writing is born. The traditional model often presents writing as a revolutionary invention, springing forth almost fully formed to meet the administrative needs of a complex state, to track taxes, record laws, and glorify kings. The Jiahu finds suggest an alternative, more gradual and organic origin. Perhaps writing began not in the palace or the temple treasury, but in the shaman's tent. Its first seeds may have been sown in the human desire to mark sacred objects, to communicate with the spirit world, or to denote clan identity in rituals for the dead. It may have been a tool of magic and religion long before it became a tool of bureaucracy. The tortoise shells from Jiahu sit at this mysterious crossroads. They may not be writing as we define it, but they represent a critical cognitive leap, the moment when humans began to use permanent, abstract symbols to encapsulate meaning, a conceptual breakthrough that would, millennia later, flower into one of the world's most enduring and beautiful scripts. They are a poignant reminder that every great tradition begins with a single, uncertain mark. Now, let's travel across continents and forward in time, from the Neolithic ritual symbols of Jiahu to a tranquil lakeshore in northern Greece, where a discovery submerged in water and time would challenge a fundamental pillar of European history. In 1992, during an archaeological survey of a prehistoric lake settlement near the village of Dispilio, a team led by Greek archaeologist George Armouziades made a find that seemed to defy the established timeline. Preserved in the waterlogged, oxygen-deprived mud of the lakebed was a flat piece of wood, a tablet, roughly the size of a large book. This in itself was a minor miracle, as wood and other organic materials rarely survive for more than a few centuries. But this was no ordinary piece of timber. When it was carefully cleaned and examined, it revealed a series of carefully engraved linear symbols, marks that were clearly made by a human hand with a sharp tool. The real shock came with the radiocarbon dating. The Ebla tablet, along with other wooden structural elements from the site, was dated to around 5,260 years before the Common Era. This places it firmly in the late Neolithic period, making it over 7,000 years old. To understand just how revolutionary that date is, consider this. It was created more than 2,000 years before the famed Minoan civilization of Crete arose, and a full 4 millennia before the development of the Linear B script. If these marks are indeed a form of writing, the history of literacy in Europe must be completely rewritten. The symbols themselves are the heart of the mystery. They are not simple pictures or random scratches. They are a series of abstract linear signs, lines, arcs, and angular shapes arranged in what appears to be a deliberate, structured sequence. Some look like a branching tree, others like a comb, a ladder, or a series of linked diamonds. They are carved in rows, suggesting a direction of reading, a systematic attempt to convey information. This is not a single, isolated mark of ownership or a tally count. The arrangement implies syntax, a potential grammar governing the order of the symbols. What could they mean? The most compelling interpretation is that they represent a very early form of proto-writing. Perhaps they recorded a lunar calendar, tracking the phases of the moon for agricultural or ritual purposes. They could be a list of commodities, a record of a significant event, or even a form of sacred communication, a prayer or a myth inscribed on a durable medium. The settlement of Ebla was a sophisticated stilt house village, a community of farmers, herders, and fishermen who had the need and the intellectual capacity to develop a system for recording information. The tablet is a tangible product of that complex, organized mind. Of course, a claim this monumental is met with intense and understandable skepticism from the broader academic community. The primary criticism hinges on a single, crucial point. We have only one. The Ebla tablet is a unique object. There is no corpus of texts, no bilingual inscription, no repetitive pattern across multiple artifacts that would allow scholars to perform the statistical and comparative analysis needed to definitively prove it is a writing system. Without a larger body of evidence, it is nearly impossible to distinguish a nascent script from a set of sophisticated property marks, ritual symbols, or even an elaborate decorative pattern. Skeptics argue that until more examples are found, the tablet remains an intriguing anomaly, a fascinating glimpse into Neolithic symbolism, but not definitive proof of writing. The burden of proof, they rightly note, is exceptionally high when overturning a historical paradigm as established as the Mesopotamian origin of writing. Furthermore, the fact that no similar system seems to have been adopted or developed by later cultures in the region for thousands of years is a point of contention. If this was a functional writing system, why did it apparently die out without a trace, leaving no evolutionary legacy that led to the scripts of the Bronze Age? The story of the Ebla tablet is also a dramatic tale of preservation and fragility. Its survival for over 7 millennia is a fluke of geology and chemistry. The tablet sank to the bottom of the lake, where it was buried in anoxic mud, an environment devoid of oxygen that prevents the growth of the microbes and fungi that would normally cause wood to rot away to nothing. It was in effect placed in a natural time capsule. The moment it was lifted from that protective environment, its race against time began anew. Exposure to air initiated immediate and potentially catastrophic deterioration. The conservation of waterlogged wood is one of archaeology's most delicate challenges. As the water inside the wood cells evaporates, surface tension can cause the cell walls to collapse, leading to severe warping, cracking, and ultimate destruction. To prevent this, the tablet and other wooden artifacts from the site had to undergo a years-long process of conservation, likely involving gradual replacement of the water within the wood with a stabilizing substance like polyethylene glycol, followed by careful, controlled drying. This painstaking work is a testament to the immense value placed on this object, a silent battle fought in laboratory vats to save a whisper from the Stone Age. So, where does this leave us? The Ebla Tablet sits in a tantalizing, unresolved space between prehistory and history. It is a powerful reminder of how much of the human story is written on perishable materials, on wood, bark, leather, and cloth, materials that vanish in almost every climate on Earth, leaving behind only the durable stone, pottery, and occasional metal to tell the tale. The invention of writing, as recorded in the history books, is based almost entirely on what survived: the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and the stone inscriptions of Egypt. But what if other cultures in other places independently developed their own systems of recording language on wood? We would never know. The Ebla Tablet is a rare and precious exception, a ghost from a world usually lost to us. It forces us to consider a much more complex and diverse narrative for the origins of literacy, one that may have seen multiple, independent experiments in writing spring up in different Neolithic societies, experiments that flourished briefly and then vanished when the communities that created them dispersed or changed, their fragile wooden records returning to the earth from which they came. It stands as a humble yet profound challenge to our assumptions, a piece of wood that carries not just enigmatic symbols, but the weight of a potential paradigm shift, waiting silently for future discoveries to either confirm its profound significance or consign it to the category of a beautiful, solitary mystery. But even the tantalizing mystery of the Ebla Tablet is not the final stop on our journey into the deepest origins of the written word. To find the very oldest markings that some believe could be a form of writing, we must travel further back in time, to the heart of the Neolithic Balkans, and to a culture that flourished for over 1,000 years, from around 5,300 to 4,300 years before the Common Era. This is the Vinča culture, named after a site near modern-day Belgrade in Serbia. The Vinča people were not simple farmers. They were Europe's first metallurgists, living in large, densely populated settlements, crafting exquisite pottery and sophisticated figurines with strikingly stylized faces. And on many of these artifacts on pottery, on spindle walls, and especially on small, portable clay tablets, they inscribed a collection of strange, abstract symbols. These are the Vinča symbols, and they represent one of the most profound and contentious puzzles in all of archaeology. Are we looking at the world's oldest writing system, a script that predates Mesopotamian cuneiform by over 2,000 years? Or are these marks something else entirely, a sophisticated but ultimately non-linguistic code? The symbols themselves are mesmerizing in their variety and abstraction. There are over 1,000 known inscriptions, featuring a repertoire of more than 400 distinct signs. Unlike the pictorial hieroglyphs of Egypt, the Vinča symbols are predominantly geometric and linear. You see combinations of straight lines, angles, crosses, star-like patterns, branching forms that resemble trees or antennae, and spirals. Some of the most common include the chevron, the meander, the comb, and a symbol that looks strikingly like a double axe or a butterfly. What is immediately apparent is that this is not random doodling. The symbols appear consistently across a wide geographical area, from Romania and Serbia to Bulgaria and parts of Greece, and they persist with remarkable stability for a millennium. This widespread and enduring use strongly suggests they were a shared system of communication, a set of conventional signs that held agreed upon meanings for the Vinča people. The symbols are often incised onto the bottom of pots, perhaps indicating ownership or the contents, and on those small clay tablets, which may have served a more complex symbolic or administrative purpose. The great debate that has raged for decades centers on a single, crucial question: do these symbols constitute writing? The traditional definition of true writing, or glottography, is a system of visible marks that represents the specific sounds of a spoken language. It is a graphic representation of speech. By this strict definition, no one has yet proven that the Vinča symbols qualify. we have no Vinci Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text to use as a key. The inscriptions are also extremely short. Most consist of only 1 or 2 symbols, and only a handful feature more than 5. This makes it nearly impossible to perform the kind of statistical analysis of sign repetition and combination that helped crack Linear B. Without longer texts, identifying grammatical patterns or a full phonetic system is a monumental challenge. This has led many mainstream scholars to classify the Vinci symbols as proto-writing. This is a crucial category that sits between simple picture-making and full literacy. Proto-writing systems can convey information, but they do so without directly encoding the flow of spoken language. Think of a modern road sign. A triangle with an exclamation mark communicates danger or warning effectively, but it doesn't tell you what the danger is or in what language to say it. Similarly, the Vinci symbols could have functioned as a system of clan marks, religious symbols, ownership labels, or tokens in a system of accounting. A pot marked with a specific symbol might indicate it belonged to a particular family, or that it contained a specific type of grain or oil reserved for a ritual. The small tablets might have been tallies or receipts in a complex system of economic exchange that we can no longer reconstruct. In this view, the Vinci people developed an incredibly sophisticated and widespread system of symbolic communication, but it was a code for concepts and things, not for the words of their language. However, a compelling and vocal minority of researchers argues that we should not be so quick to dismiss the possibility of true writing. They point to the sheer complexity and standardized repertoire of over 400 signs. A system of mere ownership marks or basic tallies would not require such an extensive and elaborate alphabet. The stability of the symbols across centuries and hundreds of miles also suggests a formalized system that was taught and passed down, much like a writing system. Some proponents, like the late archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, famously argued that the symbols were indeed a script, intimately tied to the religious and social life of what she termed Old Europe, a largely matrifocal and peaceful society that was later overrun by patriarchal Indo-European-speaking invaders. While her specific theories are controversial, they highlight the tantalizing possibility that we are underestimating the intellectual achievements of these Neolithic societies. Perhaps the Vinci script was not used for lengthy historical narratives or poetry, but for short, potent ritual incantations, the names of gods, or the titles of powerful individuals, a specialized, elite writing that never needed to evolve into lengthy texts. The true power of the Vinci symbols, regardless of the final verdict on their linguistic nature, lies in what they tell us about the human mind. Their appearance in the Neolithic represents a cognitive revolution every bit as important as the invention of the plow or the smelting of copper. It marks the moment when humans moved beyond representing the world as they saw it, painting a bison on a cave wall, to representing the world through abstract concepts. A spiral is not a thing you can point to, it is an idea. A series of branching lines can represent a family lineage, a system of trade routes, or a philosophical concept. The creation of these symbols required the capacity for abstract thought and the shared social agreement that a specific, arbitrary mark could hold a specific meaning. This is the very foundation upon which all writing, mathematics, and complex science is built. The Vinci people were pioneering this fundamental technology of the mind. When we place the Vinci symbols alongside other potential proto-writing systems, like the Jiahu markings in China and the Ebla tablet in Greece, a fascinating pattern begins to emerge. It suggests that the drive to create permanent, abstract symbols was not a single, solitary invention that happened once in Mesopotamia and then spread. Instead, it appears to be a universal human urge, emerging independently in different parts of the world as societies reached a certain level of complexity. The Neolithic period was not a dark, silent prelude to history. It was a bubbling cauldron of innovation where multiple cultures were experimenting with the very idea of recording information. Some of these experiments, like the Vinci symbols, may have eventually faded away, their meanings lost when their cultures transformed or collapsed. Others, like the script that would eventually develop in Mesopotamia, found the right conditions to flourish and evolve into the writing systems that would shape the modern world. The silent, enigmatic marks on a Vinci pot fragment are not a failure. They are a testament to a road not taken, a brilliant flash of intellectual potential that illuminates the deep, shared human desire to make our mark, to communicate across time, and to impose an abstract order upon the world. They are the ghost of a possibility, a whisper from a time when writing was still a dream taking its first tentative form in clay. And so, as we return from our journey across continents and millennia, we are left not with a simple list of artifacts, but with a profound sense of connection. These 25 manuscripts are far more than ancient objects. They are fragile, enduring bridges built of clay, papyrus, and stone, each one reaching across the abyss of time to clasp our hands. They are the ultimate time capsules, granting us not just facts, but a glimpse into the very souls of our ancestors, the love and fear etched into the silver amulet from Ketef Hinnom, the bureaucratic obsession recorded on the Linear B tablets, the desperate hope for immortality carved into the pyramid texts, and the triumphant relief of the Siloam tunnel engineers. These are not abstract historical forces, they are individual human moments captured and preserved against all conceivable odds. They show us that the people of the past were not so different from us. They sought justice, wrestled with faith, fell in love, feared death, and possessed an irrepressible drive to record their existence, to shout into the future, "We were here." The sheer improbability of their survival is a story in itself. Each manuscript on our list has defied a gauntlet of destruction, war, fire, pillage, the slow, relentless decay of centuries, and the simple, casual neglect of time. The Code of Hammurabi could have been shattered into dust. The Library of Ebla might have been lost forever beneath the Syrian earth. The Nag Hammadi codices could have been used as kindling, and the Dead Sea Scrolls could have crumbled to nothing in their desert caves. That they endured is a testament not only to the durability of their materials, but to a strange, beautiful serendipity. The fires that destroyed palaces baked clay tablets to permanence. The dry desert air and the dark, airless tombs created perfect environments for preservation. The very act of hiding them for safekeeping, as with the Copper Scroll and the Nag Hammadi Library, ultimately saved them for us. Their existence today is a chain of countless lucky breaks, a whisper that somehow managed to travel through a hurricane of silence to reach our ears. This legacy is not a closed book, but an open invitation. The decipherment of Linear B and the Rosetta Stone prove that even the most impenetrable codes can be cracked. The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas and the Ugaritic texts demonstrates that our understanding of history and faith is constantly being rewritten. For every mystery we have solved, another waits in the wings. The language of the Minoans on their Linear tablets remains a siren's call to linguists. The true meaning of the Vinci symbols, and whether they represent a script older than any other, is a debate that continues to ignite passions. Who knows what still lies buried? A forgotten cave, a waterlogged tomb, a sealed jar beneath the sands could at any moment yield a new library, a new poem, a new law code, or a new gospel that will once again append everything we thought we knew. The sands of time have not given up all their secrets. They are simply waiting for the next curious mind, the next patient hand, to uncover the next whisper from our collective past. Ultimately, this journey through the oldest manuscripts ever found reaffirms the enduring, transformative power of the written word. It is our species' greatest technology. It allowed a king in Babylon to project his laws across an empire, a poet in Mesopotamia to explore the terror of mortality, and a community by the Dead Sea to prepare for the end of the world. It gave us the ability to build upon the knowledge of previous generations to create literature, science, history, and philosophy. These texts remind us that writing is a form of magic. The magic of capturing a thought, a law, a prayer, or a story, and granting it a life far longer than that of its author. It is the closest we come to immortality. As we close this chapter, remember that these manuscripts are not relics to be merely admired from a distance. They are conversations. They are an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present, challenging us to listen, to learn, and to continue adding our own voices to the grand, unending story of humanity.